Chapter 679. That day, the surging blood-colored clouds in the sky really looked like red waves hanging upside down in the sky. They surged wave after wave, bringing with them the sound of wind and thunder. Deep within the clouds, lightning flickered indistinctly. It was as vigorous as a dragon, but also as restless as a huge silver snake. It shuttled through the sea of blood, and from time to time, it would poke its head out to look down at the world, baring its ferocious fangs. The sea of blood surged and the waves surged, approaching the last bit of gap. The waves rolled thousands of feet, and slowly smoothed out the remaining gap of the halo. Under the dark clouds, the huge immortal city looked very much like a dead city. The once bustling city was no longer there, and everywhere was deserted. At this point, anyone could see that the situation was not quite right. The ordinary people who could leave had already left. Those who couldn't leave, or those who had the heart but were powerless, or those who had great ambitions, wanted to see what would happen here. Life was like this. When you were young, you would always have dreams, always have lofty aspirations, and look down on the world. You would hope that one day you would stand at the top of the mountain, and then, with slight fatigue and pride, say that life was just like that. However, dreams were dreams. Other than those favored by the heavens who had the right time, place, and luck, most people were destined to be just ants. A young man with great ambitions would struggle and work hard for half his life. At a certain time, he would suddenly discover or have an epiphany. It turned out that there was actually an invisible wall in front of him that he couldn't climb over no matter what. He looked around, he racked his brains, he thought of all the methods, and then he discovered that this was the only narrow space left for him in this world. He couldn't go up. There was originally a door on the wall, but it had already been locked by the person behind the wall. Thus, people who cultivated halfway could not advance or retreat. There was no way forward, and it was even more miserable to retreat. Because you had tasted the sweetness and benefits of cultivation, how could you be willing to return to that lowly and poor world of mortals? Countless people were like desperate ants, trapped there. They had to work like cattle and horses for others, and there was nothing they could do. The cultivation world was so harsh, so powerful, and so orderly. No one could challenge this rule. Unless you were a heaven-defying genius, a favored son of the heavens. But if you really were such a peerless character, in the long history of the past, everyone who had climbed over the wall would turn around and lock the incomparably heavy door once again. A young dragon slayer turned into an evil dragon. Most people did not have the ability or the courage to break through their shackles until they suddenly saw a strange change in the sky. It looked like the sky was changing color. Perhaps it would destroy the world, or perhaps it would just break the shackles. The possibility of this happening was actually very low, but there were people who were looking forward to it. For this reason, they did not hesitate to take the risk of staying in this ever-changing city, waiting for the arrival of the apocalypse. They were like lowly mice, but also like despicable killers, gnashing their teeth and cursing the people on the mountain, looking forward to the destruction of the world, looking forward to changing their fate. No one knew when it started, but most of the Zengxianming cultivators had returned to Mount Celestial Dragon, unwilling to go down the mountain to the immortal city. The blood waves rolled in the sky, and the immortal city was also gloomy and miserable. Many people had left, and those who were left under the dim sea of blood, for some reason, gradually began to become more and more like beasts. But even on Mount Celestial Dragon, the atmosphere became increasingly tense. Several major forces occupied their own territories, confronting each other, but gradually approaching the time when the sea of blood in the sky was completely submerged, the situation on Mount Celestial Dragon underwent a subtle change. Fiyunji still stood firm and guarded the largest territory, but the other forces, to be exact, the forces of the other deity transformation stage cultivators, began to gradually integrate and join forces. The people of the Grand Courtyard could go to the territory of the Heavenly Law Hall. The people of the Starry Hall would greet the guards of the Grand Courtyard with a smile when they saw them. The checkpoint of the Heavenly Law Hall was removed from the people of the Grand Courtyard and the Starry Hall. Everyone laughed and mingled together, like the best of brothers. Their subordinates were like this, and their leaders were also like this. Without the tacit consent of the higher-ups, This kind of thing could not happen. This situation was quickly fed back to Fiyunji. When Shui Ying opened the note in her hand, she found that half of it was dyed red with blood. It was a ghastly sight. Shui Ying silently opened the note and read it once, then touched the bloodstain with her finger and looked to the side. Old Ma was standing not far from her with a frown on his face. "There are losses?" Shui Ying asked softly. Old Ma nodded and said, "When this note was delivered, 3 people died on the way. They were all lines that we buried for a long time." Lines and shadows were common names in Fiyunji, and they represented the same meaning. A trace of sadness flashed across Shui Ying's face. She then took a deep breath and pulled herself together. Her face looked cold and said, "Are these people planning to ignore everything? They don't want the old rules anymore." Old Ma glanced at the woman sitting at the head of the table out of the corner of his eye. There was a strange look in his eyes, and he felt that it was strange. Now, the situation had clearly become clear. What was about to happen was a violent storm. However, how could this hall master of the Floating Clouds division, who was used to seeing such a scene, still be in disbelief at this kind of slaughter? Shui Ying was silent for a while, then stood up and said to Old Ma, "Since they shed all pretense of cordiality first, we must also respond." As she spoke, she walked over and handed Old Ma a piece of paper with a few names written on it. She said, "These people are the people that their halls planted here. Take some people with you and get rid of them." Old Ma's body trembled slightly, then he nodded in agreement. However, when his gaze swept over the white paper, his expression changed slightly. After a while, he looked up at Shui Ying in shock. Shui Ying smiled tiredly and said, "What, you didn't think of this?" Old Ma was silent for a while, then said, "No wonder you would let me handle such a confidential matter. These people, these spies, they can actually climb to such a high position." Shui Ying said indifferently, "There are a few people at the top who actually weren't spies from the beginning. They are the heroes of Fiyunji. They followed me and followed Lord Supreme Tianlong. After many years of hard work, they established the foundation of Fiyunji." Old Ma raised his head and looked at her. Shui Ying smiled and walked away with her hands behind her back. Only her voice was still slowly transmitted over, saying, "It's always this kind of story. People are dissatisfied. There will always be people who feel that their contributions are too great. There will always be people who are dissatisfied. There will always be people who can go through thick and thin with us but can't share the riches. This and that, they will be pulled over by others." Old Ma suddenly felt an impulse and couldn't help but ask, "Does the Lord Supreme know about this?" Shui Ying turned around and looked at him with a strange expression. "Then who do you think gave me this list?" Old Ma suddenly felt a chill in his heart and couldn't say anything. Chapter 680. The light in the underground city had unknowingly become much brighter. This was not surprising because when the blood moon changed, all kinds of lights lit up. Numerous light beams rose from various places in the empty city, and the slightly oppressive and dim environment here changed. However, the strange thing was that although everything happened so quickly and looked so grand, when the light shone out, it did not make too much noise. The scene of the sky collapsing and the earth splitting did not appear as he had imagined. However, in this strange silence, the pillars of light kept flashing, as if they were ghosts that had opened their eyes in the netherworld, staring at the center of the city. They seemed to be waiting for something. Waiting for a change. After a long and painful period of time, the souls that had been suppressed in the abyss and could not break free were all stirred up when they smelled the scent of freedom. In the sky full of light, Lu Chen's eyes finally fell on the small golden seal in perfected Lord Tianlong's hand. The Kunlun seal lay quietly in the palm of that broad palm without showing any abnormality, as if it was also waiting for something patiently. Perfected Lord Tianlong glanced at Lu Chen, smiled, and asked him in a very gentle and intimate tone, "Are you ready?" Lu Chen stared at this person, neither saying yes nor no. After a while, he suddenly asked Perfected Lord Tianlong, "This matter is of great importance. Not only our lives, but also the lives of all the people in the world may be dragged into it. Why do you always look like you don't care about it?" "Am I?" Perfected Lord Tianlong thought for a while and seemed to reflect on himself. Then he smiled and said, "Maybe it's because I'm born calm. As long as I can accept it, I'll do whatever I want." Lu Chen nodded and didn't say anything else. Without saying anything more, Perfected Lord Tunlon took 2 steps forward and looked around. He looked at the rising pillars of light and the flickering blood moon in the clouds. Then he slowly clenched the Kunlun seal in his hand. At first, the golden light was gradually blocked by his palm. Then, Lord Tunlon suddenly formed a strange seal with his hand, and a beam of golden light shot out from a strange angle in his palm. Although the light was thin, it was straight and bright. Lu Chen suddenly heard a faint sound reverberating in his ears. He almost thought that he was hallucinating at that moment, but he quickly reacted. The sound seemed to really exist, and what was even stranger was that the sound did not seem to exist in this place at all. It was the sound of the waves. It was as if the waves of the sea were crashing against the shore, crashing against the white sand. Wave after wave, it never stopped, and it was full of order. The air seemed to tremble and sway along with this sound, and an invisible wind blew past him. The wind didn't have the salty smell of the sea breeze, but it carried a hint of blood. Lu Chen's pupils shrank slightly. Perfected Lord Tianlon seemed to be determining the direction. His lips moved slightly as he silently chanted some unknown incantation. His pace was sometimes fast and sometimes slow, and his direction was sometimes left and sometimes right. The only thing that didn't change was that the beam of golden light was always in front of him. Just like that, he began to walk under the stone pillar in the center of the city. Gradually, he actually left the huge stone pillar and walked into the street filled with houses. Lu Chen followed him closely, his eyes always on Perfected Lord Tianlon's back. From his point of view, this person's back was wide open, as if he was completely defenseless against him. That wide back was so flat, coupled with the familiar aura of the ancient devil sex god subduing incantation, for a moment, Lu Chen even suddenly recalled that he was standing behind the devil sex elder Yun Shouyang many years ago. Memories flashed through his mind. There were many scenes that he thought he had long forgotten, but now he realized that they were buried deep in his heart and had never been forgotten. This scene was completely different, but he felt a suffocating feeling. It was as if the scene from many years ago was slowly overlapping with the scene that was happening today. Perfected Lord Tunlon walked a long distance in the city with a majestic gait. Along the way, there were many twists and turns. Later on, Lu Chen also realized that it seemed that the beam of light in front of him was showing signs of guiding him forward. After walking to a secluded corner deep in the city that Lu Chen had never been to before, the beam of light fell on a corner and stopped moving. Lu Chen looked left and right and found that it was an empty house. In a corner of a small courtyard, there was a dilapidated gazebo with old and broken railings. Only the stone slabs on the ground looked more or less intact after years of suffering. The golden beam of light fell on the square stone slab in the center of the gazebo and then stopped moving. Lu Chen took a deep breath and stared at the stone slab. He didn't know what secrets were hidden under this ordinary-looking stone slab. Was it the entrance to the abyss of hell or a passage for thousands of demons? Perfected Lord Tianlon flicked his finger and then slowly opened it. The beam of light disappeared, and the Kunlun seal reappeared in his palm. He walked over and stood directly on the stone slab. Then he waved his hand at Lu Chen and smiled. It was as if he had returned home, as if he was in his Kunlun Great Hall. He then sat down leisurely. Perhaps because he was too fat and too burly. When Perfected Lord Tianlon sat on the stone slab, Lu Chen had the illusion that the ground was shaking. He calmed himself down and then walked over to stand beside Perfected Lord Tianlon. He asked, "Is this the place?" "This is the place," Perfected Lord Tianlon said, "the secret door that my master left behind." He stretched out a finger and tapped on the stone slab beneath him 3 times. Dong, dong, dong. The sound was low and faintly echoed. A moment later, Perfected Lord Tianlon and Lu Chen suddenly looked up at the sky at the same time. The blood moon on the dome of the huge grotto, which had been rotating and swaying slowly, suddenly began to speed up as if it had been stimulated by something. Lu Chen stared at the blood moon for a moment and then lowered his head to look at Perfected Lord Tianlon. Perfected Lord Tianlon didn't look at him again. He calmly picked up the Kunlun seal, put it down, and stamped it on the stone slab in front of him. Then he hit it with the golden seal in the order of east, south, west, and north. Then he reversed the order and hit it again. Amidst the silence, a deep sound suddenly rang out from beneath the stone slab. On the originally seamless stone slab, a square stone slab suddenly sank down by about an inch. Looking at its size, it was about the same size as the Kunlun seal. Perfected Lord Tianlan then raised his head and looked at Lu Qin. Lu Qin only felt that his throat was a little dry. He took a deep breath and then nodded at him. "Since we've come this far, let's do it," he said. Perfected Lord Tianlan smiled, then picked up the Kunlun seal and placed it precisely in that inconspicuous little stone cave. Nothing seemed to have changed. It was still very quiet at the beginning. When the wind blew through the courtyard, their clothes swayed slightly. Then, from the depths of the ground beneath their feet, there was a sudden boom, as if something had suddenly exploded. Chapter 681. An invisible wave spread out from the depths of the ground under their feet. Strangely, Lu Qin did not actually feel the ground shaking, but he could clearly feel a wave surging out in all directions with the pavilion where he and Perfected Lord Tianlan were at the center. Then, a golden light suddenly shot out from the Kunlun seal. This light happened to be only as big as the small stone cave, but it shot straight up into the sky and did not dissipate. The surrounding wind became more intense. Perfected Lord Tianlan and Lu Qin both looked up. Under their gazes, the golden light pierced the dome like a sharp sword. It pierced through the fog, pierced through the red light, and found the blood moon that wandered between illusion and reality. Then, with a sharp whistling sound, the golden light pierced through the blood moon. At that moment, the dark red blood moon seemed to be strung on the golden light. A moment later, the sound of cracking and collapsing came from the top of the dome, which sounded like the wailing of ghosts and wolves, and also like the mournful wailing of ghosts. Only then did Lu Qin realize that his attention was completely attracted by the scene of the blood moon piercing through the sky. He did not notice that after the golden light pierced through the blood moon, it did not stop or disappear. The golden light still pierced through the dome of the cave with the momentum of piercing through the sky. Then, not long after, it shone on a certain place on the dome. The sound of the explosion came from that place. With a loud cracking sound, several huge cracks began to spread from the edge of the golden light pillar. Then, countless small stone fragments fell from the dome above. The cracks grew larger and larger, and the speed of the splitting gradually increased, quickly extending to the entire dome. Lu Qin's expression changed slightly. He suddenly turned to look at Perfected Lord Tianlan beside him, only to find that Perfected Lord Tianlan's expression was still calm, as if he was not surprised at all. It seemed that everything was within his expectations. Lu Qin stared at him silently for a moment, then looked away without saying anything. After such a long time, this underground cave that had existed for an unknown number of years seemed to be ushering in its doomsday. As the golden light from the Kunlun seal pierced through the dome and caused cracks, the scattered lights in every corner of the empty city lit up at the same time, as if they were stimulated or summoned by a leader. In the next moment, hundreds of rays of light shone brightly at the same time, like sharp swords stabbing towards the dome. An ancient and desolate aura was released from this land, as if they had suddenly returned to the distant ancient times. The blood moon in midair was pierced by thousands of arrows. Countless rays of light pierced through the blood moon in an instant. Then, these rays of light drove the blood moon and slowly ascended. At the highest dome, the stones crumbled faster and faster. From the initial finger-sized stones, they grew to the size of a head, or even half a body, and fell one after another. This was a deathly rain of stones before the doomsday. The empty city was shrouded by this rain of stones. Loud and ear-piercing collapses sounded one after another. Large holes were smashed in countless houses, and the walls and buildings collapsed, turning them into ruins. As for the place where Perfected Lord Tianlan and Lu Qin were, of course, they could not escape from the falling stones. However, when all the stones fell about 10 feet above their heads, they were bounced off by an invisible and tough barrier and fell obediently to the side. The blood moon that was pierced by countless lights did not show any signs of collapsing or scattering. At most, it only trembled violently a few times when the lights pierced the blood light. Very soon, the blood moon calmed down. Then, surrounded by all the lights, it slowly rose and floated above the dome. Boom! After a loud sound, the collapse of the dome of the cave became faster and faster, as if it had finally reached a critical point. Then, with a loud roar, dust suddenly flew, and an incomparably large stone slab fell with a sharp gust of wind. It was as if a piece of the sky had suddenly been broken, and with a whistling sound, it smashed heavily into the city. In an instant, sand and stones flew everywhere. At least a dozen houses were crushed under the stone slab and turned into nothing. Thick dust rose high like a wave and surged in all directions. Lu Chen looked at the huge stone slab that had fallen in the distance. The corner of his eyes twitched slightly, and then he raised his head and looked up. In the endless dust, there was a ray of light. Although it was not very bright and was a little dim and dark red, there was indeed a ray of light shining in from behind the thick dust. True Lord Tianlan stood up from the ground. Like Lu Chen, he raised his head and looked up at the high dome. Then, after the dust gradually dissipated, they saw the dark red sky. The surging sea of blood seemed to be hanging upside down in the sky. The waves rose and fell, and there was no trace of a normal sky anymore. This underground cave that had been buried deep underground for countless years finally saw the light of day again and was revealed under the true sky. In the cave, the sword-like rays of light that pierced the blood moon suddenly seemed to have changed. The blood moon was slowly rising. Looking at its direction, it was rising towards the huge hole that had suddenly appeared above its head, and the color of the light that pierced the blood moon gradually dimmed. Not only that, their original golden light actually began to turn blood red. From the ground, it looked like many large blood-red hands, one after another, carrying the blood moon and floating higher into the sky. Such a strange scene made people shudder. Lu Chen stared at the blood moon. Just like that, its speed gradually increased and it gradually approached the huge hole. Then, there seemed to be a sudden clap of thunder in the sky. The blood moon leaped out and suddenly left the underground world and reappeared in the world. At that moment, the blood moon trembled. Then, it shone brightly and emitted tens of thousands of rays of blood-red light, illuminating the entire immortal city and the world. A blood moon slowly rose from the immortal city, looking down on the world with the power of a king. Then, it rose all the way to the dome in the sky. In the underground world, it was unknown when it had quieted down. The light rays scattered and dissipated. Even the dark red light at the beginning had left with the blood moon. Darkness returned to this place. It seemed that this was the only color that this place should have. In that quiet and remote little pavilion, true Lord Tianlan and Lu Chen stood opposite each other. Darkness surrounded their figures. After a while, Lu Chen said in a low voice, "Is this the end or just the beginning?" True Lord Tianlan glanced at him and then looked up at the distant sky. Looking at the blood moon that was rapidly rising in the sky, he said indifferently, "Just the beginning." Chapter 682. The sky and the earth seemed to have become a little brighter. Because there was an additional blood moon in the sky, the dark red sea of blood in the sky added some light. The red light sprinkled down and gradually enveloped the entire immortal city. It also gradually covered the majestic Sky Dragon Mountain. Many people had fled from the immortal city over the past few days, so the city seemed a little empty. However, under the red moonlight, one could still see some figures flashing in some deserted streets and alleys from time to time. They shrank their heads and hid their bodies. From time to time, they would poke their heads out and peep at everything around them. They stared at the mountain peak in the distance. Under the strange blood moon, their eyes were filled with eagerness and greed. The world dominated by the cultivation world had lasted for too long. Many people were suppressed. They couldn't get the resources for cultivation. They yearned to achieve the Tao and become immortals, but they were blocked outside the wall of power. Therefore, when this malevolent and dangerous blood moon phenomenon appeared, they still refused to leave. They stayed here, waiting for an opportunity. However, Perhaps these ambitious people who were still staying in the immortal city did not notice that when they focused their attention on the surroundings and used a wolf-like gaze to look for their target, the blood moon in the sky had unknowingly quietly printed a faint layer of red in their eyes. They looked like real beasts gradually. Compared with the temporarily peaceful city at the foot of the mountain, the population density on Sky Dragon Mountain where the Zhengxianming headquarters was located had now exceeded that of the foot of the mountain. The big shots controlled it well, and the people of the major forces almost did not escape. Everyone defended their own territory and then looked at the other forces covetously. To be precise, it was actually the three major forces, Heavenly Law Hall, Desai Yard and Starry Hall, who had secretly and openly joined forces to look at Fuyunji covetously. After the blood moon appeared in the sky, the dark red moonlight sprinkled on Sky Dragon Mountain, dyeing the entire majestic mountain range a strange red. However, the imagined fighting and killing did not happen immediately. Everyone was still in their positions, but the atmosphere on the mountain had become very tense. There was no doubt that among the four major forces in Zhengxianmeng, Fuyunji was the natural leader. Whether it was the level of divine transformation stage perfected Lord Tianlan, or the strength of the people under him, Fuyunji was far better than the other three halls. On Celestial Dragon Mountain, the Floating Clouds Company had the largest territory, the most manpower, and the strongest strength. However, now that a powerful enemy was watching from the sidelines, the Floating Clouds Company's internal affairs were faintly unstable. The main reason was that in the past few days, everyone's backbone, the renowned perfected Lord Tianlan, had not appeared in front of everyone for some reason despite the tense atmosphere. This more or less affected the morale of the elites in Fuyunji, but for many years, Fuyunji was stronger than the other halls in terms of discipline, so there was not too much chaos. Otherwise, if it was the other three halls, as long as their old perfected lord did not appear, it would have been noisy by now. Even so, some malicious rumors still began to spread in the Floating Clouds department. Some were cautious and confused, some were guessing why the true monarch had hidden himself, and there were even some who were mysterious and vaguely hinting that there might be people who were afraid of the heavenly tribulation or those powerful external enemies, so they fled first. After all, there were more people who did not appear recently, including the only personal disciple whom they loved and valued the most. He had not appeared for a long time. Once this kind of rumor spread and was not controlled, the consequences would be unimaginable. However, there was a reaction in Fuyunji very quickly. In this dangerous situation where a slight move in one hair could affect the whole body, and in this confusing situation where the four great powers were at daggers drawn, the first to act was the most powerful hall in Fuyunji. Fuyunji was the first to wield the butcher's knife, the first to see blood, and the most shocking thing was that their knife was aimed at their own people. With the infamous and beautiful Hall Master Shui Ying presiding over the overall situation, the newly promoted Deputy Hall Master Ma Xiaoyan led a group of elites directly under the Hall Master, and with lightning speed, swept through the interior of Fuyunji in half a day. They wiped out 3 of Fuyunji's top powers, and killed anyone who resisted. They killed 14 of their trusted subordinates on the spot, and captured 2 of the 3 main leaders alive, while the last one was seriously injured and captured. In this storm-like sudden attack, Fuyunji once again revealed its powerful strength. At the same time, the most famous and mysterious shadow in Fuyunji also appeared again. He appeared beside one of their own people. Beside these captured leaders, there were people who changed sides on the spot, giving these people a heavy blow. Among them, the one who was seriously injured also had the highest position. Like old Ma, he was a deputy hall master of Fuyunji. He was highly respected, powerful, and fiercely resisted the attack. His subordinates were also brave and good at fighting, and they even forced old Ma and his people into a disadvantageous position. However, at the critical moment, behind this deputy hall master, there was a brother who he regarded as his own brother, who used to bleed and bleed for him, who suddenly changed the direction of the blade in his hand and slashed at this deputy hall master. The first slash cut off his right hand, the second slash cut off his left leg, and the third slash was aimed at his chest, breaking his ribs and revealing his white bones. The blade went straight into his chest. At that moment, the fierce battle on the battlefield stopped. Even those on Old Ma's side were stunned. The deputy hall master could not speak because his throat was already filled with blood. He fell to the ground and stared at his brother, his eyes filled with disbelief and despair. His brother held the blood-stained blade and looked at him silently. In the end, he said a few words, "I am the shadow." Before the news of the civil strife in Fuyunji spread, Blood Warbler and Old Ma had already taken control of the situation. Then, under the watchful eyes of the crowd, Blood Warbler did not ask for permission from Supreme Lord Tianlan at all. She directly ordered her people to push the three leaders to the border of Fuyunji's territory. The action of the crowd and the murderous intent instantly alerted the other three forces on Mount Celestial Dragon, and the place that Blood Warbler chose happened to be the intersection point of the four forces. For a moment, many people walked out with full vigilance and looked at Fuyunji's side, wondering what they were going to do. Many people had already raised their weapons, thinking that Fuyunji would probably be the first to lose control and was ready to fight. Fuyunji's side was filled with killing intent. Blood Warbler stood in the crowd and gave the order. Ma Xiaoyun walked forward expressionlessly and took a deep breath. Then, he looked at the blood-stained blade in his hand and his similarly blood-stained palm. He swung his blade, and amidst the gasps, he cut off the heads of the three people and threw them away. One head was thrown at Heavenly Law Hall, and two heads were thrown at the Grand Chancellor. Then, only the Starry Hall's side was empty, as if nothing had happened. Chapter 683. On Sky Dragon Mountain, swords were drawn and bows were drawn, undercurrents were surging, and the atmosphere was extremely tense. In contrast, the immortal city at the foot of the mountain had become very deserted due to the large decrease in population. It didn't look so tense, but in the cold wind, inside and outside the empty streets, there was still a cold, murderous aura drifting in the air. Looking at such a situation, probably no one would have thought that just a year ago, this was the most prosperous and lively place in the world. It was the holy land that all the cultivators in the world yearned for, and it was also the center of power in the cultivation world of the Central Plains. All of this was probably due to the mysterious and unfathomable blood sea phenomenon in the sky above them. Now, there was an even more bizarre blood moon. The blood moon shone down, silently covering the entire huge immortal city. In the dim red light, there seemed to be a thin mist floating on a certain deserted street. After a while, a slender figure slowly walked out of the mist. It was a young girl with an otherworldly beauty. It was White Lotus. Her complexion seemed to be a little better than before, and there was a trace of redness on her cheeks. Although her body was still a little thin, one could still see that she was a little more energetic and lively. It was probably because her body was still young after the serious injury, and was gradually recovering. There was no one on the street, and it was deserted. In the distant corner of the street or in the dark corner of some alley, there would occasionally be a figure passing by, looking more like a beast than a human. White Lotus's gaze kept looking forward. For some reason, although her expression had been very calm and unchanged, there was a kind of chaotic and interweaving emotion in her pupils. It was like a mess, but also like several different colors of light, constantly changing. Just like this, she walked through half the street, and it was very calm. Nothing unusual happened. Of course, if everything around her looked different from usual, it seemed that the abnormality would also become normal. Those eyes hidden in the dark, bright or dark, at this time, all noticed this single girl walking over. Her beauty, her frailty, and her loneliness all made White Lotus so eye-catching and dazzling on this deserted street. Like a sheep entering a pack of wolves, like a chicken crossing a fox mountain. There seemed to be some commotion in the silent atmosphere, echoing from the shadowy corners. Every time they faced such a desperate and dangerous situation, there would always be some dark side of human nature that would come out and be tested. Most people couldn't stand the test. White Lotus didn't seem to notice those prying eyes, or maybe she didn't care. She seemed to have a lot on her mind, her brows furrowed, as if there was a huge doubt pressing on her heart, forcing her to rack her brains to figure it out. However, even then, she didn't have the slightest hesitation towards the direction she was heading. She seemed to have decided where she wanted to go a long time ago, and she'd never stopped to think about the direction she was heading towards. She'd always walked resolutely towards a certain place in this city. Far away on the street, the majestic white tiger statue was enveloped by the light of the blood moon. Its strange eyes seemed to be staring at this place. When White Lotus walked halfway down the street, she passed by an inconspicuous alley. Because the alley was indeed a little narrow, the light on that side was a little dim. White Lotus didn't even look in that direction and strode past the alley. But at this time, a tall and strong figure suddenly sprang out from that dark alley. It was a burly man, and just the thickness of his arms alone was comparable to White Lotus's waist. With such a huge difference in physique, White Lotus also seemed to be surprised, but before she could react, the behemoth-like man picked up White Lotus. He let out a low woo-woo sound and carried White Lotus on his shoulder. At the same time, his eyes were faintly red, and he fiercely looked around. On the opposite side of the street, in the surroundings and in the distance, there seemed to be a few figures moving at the same time. It seemed that the people on that side also couldn't bear it and were getting restless. But there was no doubt that the strength of this strong man hiding in the alley was extraordinary. He even intimidated those potential enemies. Under his fierce gaze, the surroundings still remained quiet, and those moving figures also stopped, then disappeared into the shadows. The man let out a beast-like laughter, and his body retreated. In the blink of an eye, he brought the seemingly powerless White Lotus back into that dark alley. On the long street, it was a desolate scene. Only a gust of cold wind blew, sweeping a burst of chill. Bone-piercing cold. The long street was quiet for a while. Then suddenly, there was a strange sound, somewhat abruptly drifting on the street. That sound wasn't loud, nor was it high-pitched, nor was it clear and sharp. It sounded like a person crying in a low voice, slowly suppressing something. There was a vague kind of crazy pain, but it was suppressed by another kind of power. The street became even colder. All of a sudden, the shadows in the dark and in the light became motionless. The wind gradually carried a new sound, as if someone was drinking water, but also like someone was talking to himself, telling an ancient story that no one was listening to, a faint cry. That sound made people's scalps tingle and their hearts beat faster. Not long after, everyone's eyes fell on the entrance of the alley. The sound came from inside. Pada. There was a light sound like the sound of footsteps on the ground, and then a figure could be seen swaying. A person walked out, slightly staggering. It was White Lotus. Her footsteps were a little unsteady at first, but she quickly found a way to maintain her body's balance and steadily walked to the street. Her complexion looked a little better. Her face was ruddy, and her clothes were intact. Other than her eyes that still looked a little lost, this girl seemed to be a little better than when she came. Her clothes were clean, as if there was not a speck of dust on them. Only after a careful look would one find that on her pure white cheeks there were a few faint red spots. They looked like the traces of blood splashing. This girl raised her head to look at the sky, and then continued to walk forward. Her direction was still very clear. She was walking towards the entrance of the tunnel. After walking a few steps, White Lotus seemed to feel something. She stretched out a white palm, gently wiped it on her cheek, and then looked at it in front of her eyes. There were traces of blood on her palm. White Lotus stared for a moment, opened her mouth, and stuck out her small tongue. She gently licked it, and then continued to walk forward without changing her expression. Behind her, in that dark alley, there was a dark corner. After an unknown amount of time, from that dark corner, there was suddenly a dark red thick blood, slowly spreading out, submerging the stone tiles on the ground, like a devil's smile, slowly seeping into the long street. The color of the blood moon in the sky seemed to become even more intense at this moment. Chapter 684. Up and down the mountain, under the blood moon, blood began to flow. The blood was bright red and glaring, but the situation did not suddenly erupt or change drastically. The internal confrontation in Zhengxianmeng on the mountain was getting more and more intense, but they did not start fighting yet. Perhaps they did not know the strength of the other party, so they did not dare to act rashly. The rogue cultivators at the foot of the mountain cherished their lives more and would not make a move unless they were confident. However, there were still sporadic fights in various corners of the city. Under the gloomy sky, the suppressed sparks were slowly lighting up. In the underground cave where the sky was broken, Perfected Lord Tianlan and Lu Chen were still sitting in the gazebo in the courtyard. Lu Chen looked up at the big hole on the top of the blood moon, frowning as if he was thinking about something. Perfected Lord Tianlan glanced at him and said, "What are you thinking about?" Lu Chen pointed at the big hole on the top of the head and said, "I think it's a little strange." "Why do you say so?" Perfected Lord Tianlan asked. Lu Chen said, "Before we came down, there were many guards at the entrance of the tunnel. It's a little strange that no one came to check the situation after such a big commotion." Perfected Lord Tianlan was silent for a moment and nodded. "That's true. Do you think something happened over there?" Lu Chen said, "The other perfected lords of the divine transformation realm are not fools. They won't just sit there and wait for you to mess around. They must have some tricks up their sleeves." Perfected Lord Tianlan seemed to have no objection to Lu Chen's judgment. He nodded and said, "That makes sense. They are all old foxes. Something must have happened over there. Do you want to go and take a look?" Lu Chen turned to look at Perfected Lord Tianlan and said, "If something happens over there, will it affect what you are going to do next?" Perfected Lord Tianlan shook his head and said, "It won't, unless those 3 old fools come together. But I don't think they would expect that I won't be in Fuyunji at such a critical moment, right?" Lu Chen replied with an "oh," and then sat down beside Perfected Lord Tianlan with a calm expression. Perfected Lord Tianlan looked at him with interest and said with a smile, "Why? Aren't you going over there to take a look?" Lu Chen said calmly, "I'm not an idiot. If something really happened over there, wouldn't I be walking right into a trap if I went alone? If it wasn't for the fact that you really have a request here, that's all. Since it doesn't affect the overall situation, of course I'm comfortable staying here with you." Perfected Lord Tianlan laughed out loud and pointed at Lu Chen. "I like how straightforward you are when you speak to me." Lu Chen ignored his exaggeration. He sighed and said, "Whatever you're going to do next, you'd better do it quickly." To tell the truth, looking at this sea of blood and that blood moon, even I am terrified. "All right," Perfected Lord Tianlan nodded. "There's no hurry. It shouldn't take too long." His expression was very relaxed, without the slightest worry or annoyance. He even reached out and patted Lu Chen's shoulder lightly. "Why didn't I realize that it's so much easier to have someone like you to talk to when I'm doing such a big thing than when I'm always making decisions alone?" After a moment of silence, Lu Chen said, "Have you ever trusted anyone so much in the past?" Perfected Lord Tianlan thought about it and a trace of regret flashed across his face. He shrugged and said, "No." "Continue." Perfected Lord Tianlan said to Lu Chen, "There's still a lot to do." Lu Chen looked up at the blood moon in the sky and said, "That blood moon is still not enough?" Perfected Lord Tianlan said indifferently, "The ferocious tide of the blood moon can affect one's mind imperceptibly. If one's cultivation is not strong enough, his mind will be corrupted and he will gradually become a bloodthirsty lunatic. Even those with extremely high cultivation will be affected unknowingly if they don't resist it carefully." Lu Chen said, "With such a huge blood moon hanging in the sky, and this disgusting sea of blood, who wouldn't be careful if they said they were scared to death? I don't think those perfected lords will fall for it." Perfected Lord Tianlan laughed and said, "Who told you that the blood moon's aura only started today?" Lu Chen was startled for a moment, and then his expression changed slightly as if he suddenly remembered something. He said, "You're saying that underground?" Perfected Lord Tianlan sneered. "The blood moon appeared underground, so it must have been affected since then. Moreover, it's invisible and traceless. Who can guard against it?" Lu Chen was silent. Of course, he wouldn't ask why Perfected Lord Tianlan didn't tell him about it so that he could be prepared. There was no need for Perfected Lord Tianlan to lie to him now. Since he said that the power of the blood moon affected those perfected lords of the divine transformation realm, then it must be effective. It was just that he couldn't see it for the time being. Perhaps those few perfected lords had high cultivation and were immune to evil, or perhaps they were hiding in their bodies and could explode at any time. It was just that this scheme was truly profound. Continue. Perfected Lord Tianlan smiled and waved his hand. Finish this as soon as possible so that everyone in the world can be reborn. With that, he sat on the ground and extended a finger, pressing it gently on the Kunlun seal. Lu Chen took a deep breath and sat beside Perfected Lord Tianlan. He stared at the Kunlun seal that could activate everything. His expression became calm again and his eyes didn't change. However, a faint light flashed in the deepest part of his eyes. The Kunlun seal shone with a golden radiance once again. This time, it was even brighter than before. It was unknown what method Perfected Lord Tianlan had used, but suddenly, a rumbling sound came from the depths of the ground beneath the small pavilion. It was as though some heavy and huge rocks were moving. Furthermore, it was not just one, but many, many rocks. The ground beneath Lu Chen's feet began to tremble irregularly. For some reason, a strange image appeared in Lu Chen's mind. It was as if he was in a huge underground spell formation. Huge rocks formed the foundation of the spell formation. Now, the huge rocks were shaking off the debris left behind by the passage of time. They moved left and right and rearranged themselves. Deep underground, unknown to the people of this world, an earth-shattering change was slowly brewing. Perhaps it was a hole, perhaps it was an exit, or perhaps it was a path longed for by the darkness underground. On the ground, the surroundings of the huge hole created by the blood moon had already turned into ruins. Only a few rays of light that shot into the sky remained in the pile of rubble. At this moment, a figure slowly walked over from afar. It was a beautiful girl. It was White Lotus. She was alone, and her expression seemed to be at a loss. It was unknown what had led her all the way here. However, when she saw the huge hole, White Lotus's body suddenly shook as if she had thought of something. She quickened her pace and walked toward the hole. However, when she was halfway to the edge of the hole, she suddenly turned her head and looked at the original entrance of the tunnel. Then, her delicate and beautiful brows suddenly furrowed. Chapter 685. When the blood moon broke through the grotto, it made a lot of noise. The rocks were shattered and the place was in a mess. Several small stone mountains were formed around it. Even the entrance of the tunnel on the long street was smashed by a few large stones. It looked very messy. However, what attracted White Lotus's attention was not the standing boulders, but the many corpses lying on the ground under the rubble that had been crushed by the stones. White Lotus stared at that side for a moment, as if she wanted to go over and take a look. But when she took a step forward, she suddenly stopped and turned to the other side. Her face showed a little surprise. A low growl came from behind an irregularly shaped boulder. After a while, a huge black figure turned out from behind the boulder. It was Atsu. White Lotus's attention immediately turned from the tunnel entrance to Atsu. She looked up and down at the strong and huge black dog. White Lotus frowned, and the blank look in her eyes disappeared. She showed a look that she was familiar with in the past. She said, "Hey, you stupid dog. You seem to have grown a little." Atsu stared at White Lotus, but did not respond to her words. Atsu's reaction to this beautiful girl had always been very strange and subtle. Most of the time, it was obviously alienated, but sometimes it had a different kind of recognition. White Lotus took a few steps forward and came close to Atsu. Sure enough, Atsu did seem to be a little taller than before. Her current height only reached Atsu's chin. A beautiful girl standing next to a huge black dog. The contrast was really a little strong. White Lotus looked up at the sky. The shadow of the blood moon was reflected in her eyes. After a while, she said, "You see, this world is so unfair. When the blood moon rises, the people are in misery. I don't know how many people have suffered and will be destroyed. But a guy like you with an extraordinary bloodline can take the opportunity to grow and evolve." Atsu's head was slightly lowered, and a pair of eyes looked at the girl vigilantly. It seemed that it was still very wary of her. White Lotus smiled, turned her head and looked around. She asked, "Where is Lu Chen? Haven't you been following him?" Atsu flicked its tail and did not say a word. White Lotus looked thoughtful. She looked past Atsu's body and glanced at the big hole behind it. She nodded and said, "If you are guarding here, he is still down there?" "That's right." At such a critical time, This place is the most important. After saying that, she walked towards the huge hole. Obviously, she wanted to go over and see what the situation was like at the bottom of the big hole. After walking for a while, about 10 feet away from the hole, White Lotus suddenly noticed something. She looked back and saw that Atsu was still squatting next to the original boulder, looking at her motionlessly. Even when it saw White Lotus looking back at it, the black dog even shook its tail and tilted its head, pretending to be harmless. White Lotus looked at it for a while and then said, "No, there's something wrong with you." White Lotus turned her head and began to look at the hole not far away. After carefully observing for a moment, she saw that around the edge of the hole, among the piles of rocks, there were faint, thin golden lines flashing. Some of them were submerged in the soil, and some were buried by the gravel. But as long as one looked carefully along the lines, they would find that around the huge hole, someone had set up a strange magic array, completely surrounding the hole. White Lotus took 2 deep breaths, then took a few steps back. She turned around and walked all the way back to Atsu. Atsu looked at her, and there seemed to be a trace of regret in its eyes. White Lotus spat at it and said, "You are really not a good dog." Atsu turned a deaf ear to this comment. It stood up while wagging its tail and walked to the side. White Lotus was about to leave when she looked at Atsu again. She suddenly smiled and said, "Why don't you come with me?" Atsu raised its head and looked at her. White Lotus pointed at the hole and said, "With that damn thing around, no one can go down. Why don't we take a detour and have a look?" Atsu's eyes flashed, then it stood up without hesitation. White Lotus smiled and walked to the other end of the tunnel. The strange combination of the girl and the black dog slowly walked to the entrance of the tunnel. Before they got close, they could smell a strong smell of blood. White Lotus frowned and looked left and right, but Black Dog was 1 step ahead of her. It jumped on a large rock a few feet away from the entrance of the tunnel, then turned around and barked at White Lotus. White Lotus quickly walked over and looked behind the rock. Her body trembled slightly. There was a big pit, and the pit was full of blood. Even the ground around the pit seemed to be dyed red. Bai Lian furrowed her brows and glanced at the corpses on the ground in the distance. All she saw was that the corpses were deathly pale and completely devoid of blood. She snorted and muttered to herself, "Even if I practiced the blood food secret method, I wouldn't go so far. What the hell is that thing?" The entrance of the tunnel was open. At this time, they couldn't see what was going on underground. White Lotus was about to go down, but after taking 2 steps, she suddenly noticed that Black Dog had been staring at the blood in the big pit. Black Dog's eyes were flashing as if he couldn't bear it anymore. White Lotus's body paused for a moment. She suddenly walked over and slapped Atsu on the head. Then she scolded Atsu fiercely, "Are you crazy? Do you believe that if you go down and take a sip now, Lu Chen will wring your neck when he finds out?" Atsu let out a low growl and turned around with some difficulty. White Lotus saw a touch of red in its eyes. The two looked at each other for a moment. Atsu was the first to look away and jumped into the tunnel without saying a word. White Lotus let out a long breath and followed. Then, she suddenly laughed at herself and said, "Are you crazy? Why would you suddenly be kind enough to save this dog?" She looked up at the blood moon, and a trace of confusion suddenly appeared in her eyes. Then, she quickly lowered her head and jumped into the tunnel entrance. A rumbling sound came from the darkness, and then there was a red light, silently falling in the surroundings. Lu Chen suddenly sensed something. His expression changed slightly and he stood up from the ground. At the bottom of this huge catacomb, in an unknown corner of this empty city, outside the 4 walls, a few seemingly invisible forces suddenly stirred up from the other side of the wall. 3 directions appeared at the same time, sandwiching him and true Lord Tianlan in the middle. His heart suddenly beat faster. Chapter 686. The blood moon hung high in the sky, shining in the strange smoke and clouds, as if it was floating in a sea of blood. The dark red moonlight sprinkled down from the sky, completely enveloping the entire immortal city. If one looked from afar, they would probably see a huge inverted dark red bowl. In the headquarters of Zhengxianmeng on Sky Dragon Mountain, the atmosphere was extremely tense. Every family was very cautious, for fear that they would accidentally restrain their subordinates. If a spark were to ignite the entire Sky Dragon Mountain, which was like a barrel of dynamite. It was precisely because of this that Heavenly Dragon Mountain had actually become unusually quiet during this period of time. Besides the Floating Clouds Agency carrying out an operation to kill spies and tossing 3 heads into the territories of other powers, causing a commotion, the various powers were extremely well behaved during the rest of the time. In this situation, although Fyunji was vaguely at a disadvantage of fighting 1 against 3, from top to bottom, almost no one in this powerful hall showed a hint of fear. Instead, most people were very excited and their fighting spirit was high. If it wasn't for Hall Master Shui Ying's deliberate suppression, the people of Fyunji would have already killed their way out. In this turbulent and fierce fighting spirit, Old Ma didn't know why, but he felt somewhat out of place here. He was very worried. He was very puzzled and anxious about the possibility of Fyunji fighting 1 against 3, but the atmosphere in Fyunji made him not dare to say these words directly. Otherwise, what awaited him would probably not be a good ending. Fear of the enemy, timid as a mouse, disloyal to the master, overcautious and indecisive, and so on. Any one of these labels could make him bear the consequences. Such a tense and somber atmosphere was something that Old Ma had never experienced in Fyunji for many years. He didn't even know when this atmosphere started. Unknowingly, under this tense atmosphere, the interior of Fyunji suddenly became like this. Everyone was infinitely loyal to that supreme Tianlan and infinitely hated the enemy. Whether it was the Dazai Yard, Heavenly Law Hall, or Starry Hall, it didn't matter. The people of Fyunji were not afraid. As long as the enemy went against them, they would be defeated. A person could not say anything against such a strong and intense context, not even Old Ma. He wisely chose to follow the group consciousness that was gradually going crazy. Fortunately, he soon realized that in Fyunji, other than himself, there was another person who seemed to be still conscious. Although this person was actually the one who personally ordered the massacre, Shui Ying. Old Ma only noticed this when Shui Ying took the initiative to find him. Old Ma immediately expressed his worry to her, "Hall Master, if this goes on, things won't be right." Shui Ying looked very tired, as if she had aged a few years in this short period of time. She looked at Old Ma indifferently and said, "What's wrong?" Old Ma smiled bitterly, "Hall Master, you are asking the obvious." He pointed outside the main hall and lowered his voice. "Those people outside, even if we defeat those 3 clans this time, will they all turn into lunatics in the end?" Shui Ying was expressionless. After a while, she said, "Let's win first. We may not win if we fight 1 against 3. Old Ma was speechless and then sat down weakly. After a while, he said, "Where is Lord Supreme? Why hasn't he come out after so many days, especially in this kind of situation?" Shui Ying said indifferently, "Lord Supreme is a divine strategist, not something we mortals can guess. I just need to do my own thing." Old Ma was speechless. Then he said, "All right." Shui Ying thought for a moment, then frowned slightly and said, "But it's also strange. We don't know where the perfected monarchs are, so we don't dare to act rashly. But aren't the soul formation perfected monarchs of the 3 clans all here? Why are they so well behaved? Strange." Old Ma was startled for a moment, but then his heart skipped a beat. Before this, his attention had been focused on the strange atmosphere in the Floating Clouds office. Unlike Shui Ying, he hadn't paid attention to the abnormalities of the other 3 families. Now that she had mentioned it, he immediately realized that something was wrong. Old Ma pondered for a while, then said uncertainly, "Those 3 families seem to be waiting for something?" Shui Ying looked at him and said, "Waiting for what?" Old Ma said, "I'm waiting for an order." As he said that, he pointed his finger upwards. Shui Ying's eyes suddenly lit up. She looked at Old Ma and said in a low voice, "Could it be, they are like us, waiting for Lord Supreme to make a decision or give an order?" Old Ma nodded heavily. His breathing also became a bit hurried. He said, "Most likely. Otherwise, why haven't the 3 families attacked us yet?" Shui Ying's eyes became brighter and brighter. She said, "You mean those lords are probably not on this Sky Dragon Mountain?" Old Ma swallowed a mouthful of saliva and laughed dryly. I think it's very possible, but this is related to a perfected cultivator of the soul formation realm. Shuang took a deep breath and said slowly, it's the last moment, it's time to use those last shadows. Investigate. Shuang stood up. Her gaze was as sharp as a knife. At the same time, for some reason, there seemed to be some intense fanaticism in her. She said, get all the shadows to investigate. Find out where those soul formation perfected monarchs went. If they are not on this mountain, it will be a great opportunity for Fuyunji. Old Ma nodded and retreated, but in his heart, he didn't think much of it. He thought, Shui Ying looked calm before, why did she become so agitated in the end? When he walked out of Fuyunji's main hall, he looked up at the sky. Suddenly, his body shook. At this moment, he suddenly thought of the answer he wanted. The atmosphere in the central plains of Fuyunji was originally normal. When did it suddenly change until it became so warlike today? He carefully recalled the past and found that it seemed to have started when the blood moon suddenly broke out of the ground and hung high in the sky. He was a bit confused. For some reason, he suddenly wanted to leave this mountain, leave this city. Unfortunately, it was already a bit too late. He looked down the mountain and thought to himself, those 3 deity transformation stage perfected monarchs are not here. Could they have gone down the mountain? And the people on this mountain are going crazy. I wonder if the people at the foot of the mountain are any better? Oh woo! An ear-piercing howl came from a corner of the immortal city. A strange-looking monster flashed in a dark alley in the immortal city, then slowly left. Behind it, the blood on the ground was silently spreading. After a while, there was a plop sound. Something fell from the sky and fell right into the pool of blood. It was a palm that had been bitten off. Chapter 687. Sometimes, it was really hard to say whether the most important thing in a force was a deity transformation stage perfected monarch or the numerous cultivators who made up the majority of the force after having a deity transformation stage perfected monarch who was almost completely superior to ordinary cultivators. In a thriving, constantly developing, and perfect force, as the supreme leader, the spirit-severing stage true monarch often had supreme authority and power. In the vast majority of cases, the spirit-severing stage true monarch himself would naturally become the natural representative of the force. When everyone thought of such a force, the first person that came to mind was such a spirit-severing stage true monarch. For example, when it came to Fuyunji, they would think of Tianlan. When it came to Heavenly Law Hall, they would think of Tai Hu. When it came to Grand Chancellor, they would also think of Guangbo. This had almost become an unwritten rule. And most of the time, because of the powerful influence of the spirit-severing stage true monarch, their personal temperament and characteristics would also affect the image of their force. For example, Fuyunji was very much in line with Tianlan's belligerent, valiant, untamed, and even supercilious temperament. The people of Heavenly Law Hall were often more old-fashioned and unyielding, very much like Tai Hu. As for the people of Grand Chancellor, everyone seemed to prefer money. Therefore, most of the time, the spirit-severing stage true monarch was really one with the force on their side. In the eyes of most people, the most important thing in a force was of course the spirit-severing stage true monarch, including the spirit-severing stage true monarch himself. Everything could be sacrificed. As long as one was alive, the force, subordinates, and people could be rebuilt again. At most, it would be a little troublesome. It was unknown whether this was the natural thinking of those in a superior position. Like gods, they looked down on the world and regarded mortals as ants. They were indifferent and merciless, and probably didn't care much about the lives in their hands. For example, if the lives of 70% of their subordinates could be exchanged for the life of Tianlan, then Tai Hu, Guangbo, and Guyu probably wouldn't hesitate at all. Although these things were cruel and merciless, it was actually not uncommon in the long history of mankind. Most mortals didn't understand, but there were always some people who loved to read. Sometimes, these people didn't want to die. They wanted to change their fate, and from time to time, they would cause some trouble. A long time ago, a highly respected deity transformation stage perfected cultivator had given these troublemakers a nickname, saying that they were restless ants. Although they were restless, they were still ants. When Lu Chen sensed the 3 auras from outside the house, he suddenly felt like an ant. Although there was nothing strange outside the wall, the invisible aura was like rolling waves. Although there was no tremor in the ground, it was as if a giant had stepped on it, surging over with the force of an avalanche. It was not as if he had never seen such a powerful aura before. A long time ago, perfected Lord Tianlan had a similar aura. It was like a mountain, like a god, and like a demon. Furthermore, the aura of that damn Baldy was even more powerful than the 3 forces outside. Of course, now that the 3 forces had arrived together, their auras had firmly suppressed perfected Lord Tianlan. Lu Chen didn't need to guess who the people outside were. Sometimes, strength was the best proof, and it couldn't be faked. However, at the same time, there were countless questions that arose in his mind. Why did those 3 outside actually come to this underground cave together? They actually abandoned the meticulously prepared arrangements on Heavenly Dragon Mountain, directly jumping out of the maze and directly attacking the root of the problem. They seemed to have viciously seized the Floating Clouds Division's core weakness in one go. Lu Chen didn't doubt that he and the damn Baldy had come here in the most secretive manner. The news couldn't have been leaked. Otherwise, if perfected Lord Tianlan couldn't even do this, he wouldn't have been able to achieve what he had today. He turned to look at perfected Lord Tianlan beside him, only to see that the damn Baldy's expression was the same as usual, as if he was not surprised at all. He just raised his head slightly and stared at the high wall in front of him. His eyes flashed with interest, as if he was waiting or expecting something. What was he waiting for? Was it a person, or something that was about to happen? Lu Chen felt a little nervous, and his throat was a little dry. His mind was spinning frantically, and then he suddenly thought of something. He felt as if he had vaguely grasped something at that moment, as if there was something that he had overlooked. That dragon! The black dragon! The black dragon that he had personally gone to the sky of the forbidden area of Kunlun Mountain and secretly brought to Immortal City with the Kunlun seal. He had only seen it once, and then disappeared without a trace. Where did the black dragon go? Perfected Lord Tianlan slowly stood up and took a step forward. One of his feet landed on the stone slab in front of him, stepping on the Kunlun seal. The golden light immediately disappeared and was completely covered up. The aura in the courtyard became much quieter, but soon another new, powerful, and unruly aura rose like a mountain. It even overflowed the entire courtyard, and it was overbearing. That was perfected Lord Tianlan's own aura. My old friends, it's been a long time. He laughed loudly, and his figure was as lofty as an abyss and a mountain. He looked down on the world and said with a smile, "Why don't you come in and talk?" His voice was like a wave, reverberating far away. It reverberated in this huge underground cave, and seemed to cause a circle of ripples in the air. No one responded to the 3 powerful auras outside the wall. But after a while, at the front of the house, the door that Lu Chen carefully closed after perfected Lord Tianlan and Lu Chen came in, suddenly creaked and was pushed open. Then a person walked in. He had white hair and a ruddy complexion. It was perfected Lord Tiao. He walked slowly with a calm expression. There were many winding corridors and gardens in this house, and it was quite interesting. But perfected Lord Tiahu had no intention of taking a detour. He just stared at perfected Lord Tianlan and stared at him. Then he walked straight towards him. He did not take a detour, nor did he take a turn. In front of him, all the stones, corridors, flowers, and trees in the way were suddenly pushed away, pressed down, and then crushed by an invisible force when they were about 10 feet away from the old man. Trees were uprooted and flew out of the wall. Boulders rolled into the distance, and the corridors tilted and collapsed, making way for him. He walked majestically to the small pavilion, then looked at perfected Lord Tianlan and said, "You're finished, Tianlan." Chapter 688. "You're done for," sounded very down to earth, like the threatening words that mortals used when quarreling with each other in the streets. Their faces were red and their necks were thick, and they were accompanied by a sneer of ridicule. It was not in line with people's imaginations of a deity transformation stage perfected cultivator. At the very least, he would say something more majestic. He would either hide his intentions, speak with a hidden meaning, or have a profound meaning, or make people think of endless possibilities. In the end, true monarch Tiehu came up with such a simple statement, it really made people's jaws drop. But this sentence, which did not seem to fit his identity, after Supreme Tai who said it, made everyone present, whether they were inside or outside the room or not, feel that it was natural and very imposing. Perhaps, this was the natural halo of a person who was in a high position. Once you had power and status, whatever you said would be right most of the time. It was ridiculous for mortals to say such words, but it was amiable for a deity transformation stage perfected cultivator to say the same words. It was ridiculous and contemptuous for mortals to fight, but a fight between a deity transformation stage perfected cultivator would cause the world to change color and all living beings to revere him. Immortal Tianlan did not seem to have much of a reaction to Immortal Tiehu's simple words. He even smiled curiously and said, "Oh, why do you say so? You are perverse and unjust." He looked straight at Lord Tianlan and said in a clear voice, "All living beings in the world have been harmed time and time again. The people have no way to live and their blood has flowed. You have suffered for a long time. The cultivators in the world want to pursue the Tao of immortality, but the Fuyan Agency has been imposing taxes and plundering the world's rare resources for their own use. They have been unable to improve themselves and you have suffered for a long time. The alliance of perfected immortals is originally the righteous path in the world, but because of you, you have been tyrannical and tyrannical. You have exploited the common people." This long passage of words contained 3 lines of, "I've been suffering for a long time." It was said with a long breath and a majestic aura, making people sigh in admiration. They thought to themselves that this was indeed the words of a deity transformation stage perfected monarch. Even Lu Chen could not help but sneak a glance at perfected Lord Tianlan, thinking to himself, although these words sound like irresponsible and random framing, it seems to be somewhat justifiable if this damn Baldy is really the culprit. Perfected Lord Tianlan looked a little displeased after being scolded in such a manner. He waved his hand and said, "We're all the same here. It's the same no matter who it is. Cut the crap." True Lord Steel Pot sternly said, "Nonsense, you are the only one who did all these bad things." Perfected Lord Tianlan glared at him and suddenly grinned. "Alright, got it. If I still win after today, then all these bad things will be on your head." True Lord Steel Pot's expression did not change, as if he did not care, and said, "As you wish." Perfected Lord Tianlan continued, "There's someone else here. Why don't you come in and meet us?" Tai Hu True Monarch did not speak. After a moment, the west wall of the courtyard suddenly let out a muffled rumble, and then the entire wall collapsed. After a while, amidst the flying dust, perfected Lord Guangbo, the first seat of the Desai Yard, strolled in slowly with an amiable smile and a gentle expression. He said to perfected Lord Tianlan with a smile, "Long time no see, long time no see." Perfected Lord Tianlan looked at perfected Lord Guangbo, seeing that the two of them had separated from each other and formed a pincer attack with him. He did not say much and only smiled. "Where's the other one?" As soon as he finished speaking, he heard a voice behind him. It seemed to be on the long street outside, but it also seemed to be at the end of a street further away. Although the voice was clear and loud, the tone was erratic, as if it was constantly moving. The voice said with a long laugh, I'm here." Listening to the familiar voice, it was the master of Starry Hall, perfected Lord Guyu. Lu Chen secretly furrowed his brows. Even though Guyu perfected Lord hadn't revealed himself completely, his current position formed an iron triangle with perfected Lord Steel Pot and perfected Lord Guangbo, trapping perfected Lord Tianlan in the middle. This meant that there was no leeway, no way out. For many years, no one had dared to kill a divine transformation stage perfected Lord. The reason for this had been mentioned many times. This time, it seemed that they had made up their minds. If he could see it, the other divine transformation stage perfected lords would certainly understand the hidden meaning. For a while, these divine transformation stage perfected lords did not speak. It was unknown whether they had nothing to say or were waiting for something. But at this time, the three divine transformation stage perfected lords in the courtyard suddenly looked up at the same time. They saw that in this abandoned underground city, there was a strange and magnificent magic formation, and all kinds of flickering and rising light beams suddenly changed. About 30% of those rising light beams suddenly dimmed and then quickly disappeared. The result of that was obvious. The once vibrant and visibly powerful spell formation suddenly became shaky. Without the supporting beams of light in many crucial locations, the unique, ancient, and boundless presence of the surroundings weakened at once. Lu Chen was especially sensitive to this because he had only felt this kind of feeling from the demon sex god subduing incantation formation many years ago in the Battle of the Desolate Valley. Perfected Lord Tianlan's expression changed slightly and a trace of killing intent flashed across his face. He said coldly, "You actually did something here." Perfected Lord Gu Yu of Starry Hall's deep and long voice floated over from afar. "It's just some insignificant tricks. It's just a little trick passed down from the ancestors." After a pause, he said with a smile, "Back then, you asked me to help you set up the formation. Although you also cleaned it once after that, these small loopholes are the Starry Hall's ability to make a living. It's not a big deal that you didn't find them." Perfected Lord Tianlan was silent for a moment, then sighed and said, "When I asked you for help, these things didn't happen at all. Did you already have the intention to plot against me at that time?" No. True Monarch Gu Yu's voice denied, "That's impossible. Dao Brother Soaring Sky, you're a man of great talent and bold vision. I, your little brother, would never dare to go against you. These are just some small things that you added in casually, they're not worth mentioning." Little tricks that are not worth mentioning casually? Perfected Lord Tianlan sneered, but his expression became more and more serious. In front of him, Perfected Lord Tiehu and Perfected Lord Guangbo looked smug. Immortal Guangbo said leisurely, "Tianlan, your biggest mistake is that you left Celestial Dragon Mountain. If you were still in the unfathomable Kunlun Palace, we would still be a little afraid of you. But now that you're in the underground, you're courting death." Perfected Lord Tiehu sneered, "Here, the three of us are fighting against one of you. On the mountain, three forces are attacking one of you. No matter how I look at it, you're dead meat. What else do you have to say?" Speaking of this, he smiled and touched his beard. "I told you that you're dead meat, but you didn't believe me." Perfected Lord Tianlan glanced at him, then grinned and stretched out his palm to touch his bald head. Chapter 689. White Lotus turned her neck as if she felt a little stiff and numb. She didn't stop because of this, but continued to walk forward in the tunnel in front of her. The tunnel was abnormally quiet, and her footsteps seemed to be as silent as the legendary cat steps. After walking for a while, Bai Lian seemed to have thought of something and turned around to look. As expected, the tall black dog, was still following behind her. However, it seemed like there were pads of meat under its feet as well. Every step it took was silent. White Lotus looked at Atsu and suddenly smiled. "We look a little scary now. Don't tell me we'll fight each other before we ambush others?" Atsu didn't seem to understand White Lotus's words. It raised its head and sniffed the air a few times, then continued to walk forward. White Lotus shrugged and continued to walk forward with Atsu. After walking through the long tunnel, they finally saw the exit. It was so quiet outside that it was a little scary. White Lotus and Atsu didn't directly walk out of the exit. Instead, they leaned against the stone wall at the entrance of the cave, and then secretly poked their heads out to take a look. The dome of the huge cave had a big hole, and the underground city that hadn't seen the light of day for many years was finally exposed to the outside world. However, the sunshine didn't come because the sky was covered by the blood clouds. Everything was gloomy and very depressing. But in comparison, the underground city seemed to be a little brighter than the world above. Light beams rising from the houses and streets could be seen everywhere, illuminating the surroundings. Although they didn't know the purpose of these light beams, it seemed to be more lively than before. Apart from that, this place was completely empty. There was nothing out of the ordinary. However, the silence of the entire underground cavern was the strangest thing about it. White Lotus retracted her head, looked at Atsu on the other side of the tunnel, and said in a low voice, "You go and take a look first." Atsu looked around for a while, then retracted its head, and then glanced at White Lotus. Although it still couldn't speak the human language, the contempt in this black dog's eyes was very obvious. "Pff." White Lotus snorted softly, but she didn't show much disappointment. She probably already knew this result. She just looked down at the large houses and city below, and then looked up at the blood moon and dark clouds that were vaguely visible outside the huge hole high above. She couldn't help but frown. After a while, she could be heard whispering to herself, "Just a little more, just a little more." Black Dog looked up at the beautiful girl with some surprise, only to see White Lotus lowering her head and muttering to herself. Her expression was solemn, and her eyes were suddenly different from before. They became sharp and gloomy, as if the temperament of her body had suddenly changed. Atsu was a little surprised, and there was suddenly a little more vigilance in its eyes. It stood up, and when it was about to put on a bit of a guard, it suddenly saw White Lotus's body tremble violently, and a trace of incomparable pain flashed across her beautiful face. Her muscles twisted as if something had twisted in her mind at that moment, causing her extreme pain. The next moment, the expression on White Lotus's face suddenly became blank again. She held her head with both hands, gently patted it a few times, and then looked up at Atsu. Atsu's eyes were filled with shock. White Lotus looked at Atsu for a while, then smiled. She stretched out a white finger, put it vertically to her lips, and whispered to Atsu, "Don't tell anyone." At that moment, she smiled sweetly, and there was a little indifference in her smile. Her white skin and red lips contrasted with each other, like a painting carved in this cold cave. Boom! Suddenly, a sound came from a distant high place, like a rumbling thunder, causing the world to shake in echo. White Lotus and Atsu both turned their heads and looked. The place where the sound came from was not underground, but in the vast sky outside the hole. A round blood moon, unknowingly moving directly above the hole, or perhaps it had never gone far, but the sea of blood and dark clouds that originally covered it had dispersed. A ray of moonlight, a dark red and deep moonlight, fell from the sky, directly into this underground world. Although the blood moon was now hanging high in the sky, and was much farther away than when it was hidden in this underground cave, but for some reason, the moonlight that fell at this moment seemed to be brighter than all the other lights in the past. Like a sharp sword, it broke through the sky, with an invisible whistling sound, and instantly fell in a place in this underground city. Boom! The ground shook, and sand and stones flew. At least 5 or 6 houses around the blood moon were suddenly crushed by a huge force, and then turned into ashes. And in the smoke and dust from a collapsed wall, White Lotus and Atsu suddenly saw from afar, there were still a few figures standing in the blood moon's light. Strangely, although the houses in the periphery were instantly destroyed by the sudden attack of the blood moon, the interior of the blood moon, which was supposed to be the most dangerous and terrifying place, didn't suffer too much damage. It seemed like the few people were in a small house. White Lotus even vaguely saw a small pavilion in the blood moon's light. There was a tall and sturdy bald man, and another man standing beside him. And outside the small pavilion, there were 2 other blurry figures. It was also at this moment that White Lotus suddenly felt her heart skip a beat. The unremarkable man standing in the pavilion, who had been silent all this time, suddenly turned his head and looked in her direction. That's right. None of the other people who looked like they were overflowing with auras noticed her. Only this unremarkable man, who looked a lot worse than the other 3, suddenly looked in her direction. That gaze was calm, without any murderous intent, surprise, or pity, as if it did not have any color of emotion. White Lotus slowly retracted her body and leaned her back against the stone wall. After a while, the corner of her mouth twitched. "Interesting," she said softly. Lu Chen turned his head. It looked as if he had turned his head casually because his neck was stiff, and then he continued to look at perfected Lord Tunlun. This damn Baldy still looked calm, as if he was not aware that he was surrounded by 3 perfected lords of the same level as him and was about to be beaten up. He just looked at perfected Lord Tiehu, reached into his pocket, and began to take something out with a smile. Perfected Lord Tiehu and Perfected Lord Guangbo's eyes immediately fell on his hand. Before he took out the thing, a green light full of vitality was already gushing out. Chapter 690. The people on the mountain were different from the people at the foot of the mountain, even though they looked the same most of the time. However, in this immortal city ruled by Zhengxianmeng, the people with the identity of Zhengxianmeng were obviously very different from the individual cultivators and civilians at the foot of the mountain. In daily life, most of the individual cultivators were unwilling, or rather, did not dare to directly provoke the people of Zhengxianmeng, especially after the other party had revealed their identity. If they still provoked or did anything against them, it would be disrespectful to the whole of Zhengxianmeng, and it would easily attract the attention of more powerful forces. Therefore, in normal times, the people of Zhengxianmeng could do whatever they wanted in the immortal city most of the time. Of course, they could not go too far. For example, the famous Heavenly Law Hall in Zhengxianmeng had the power to supervise the discipline. Those who were caught by the Heavenly Law Hall did not end up well. But in general, entering Zhengxianmeng was still the dream of many cultivators in the world. However, if there was a flaw, even if it was not obvious in the past, it still became obvious at this critical moment. Although there were undercurrents and factions in Zhengxianmeng, the few big bosses were all powerful figures, and they managed to subdue the forces in their hands. Therefore, when the signs of the apocalypse appeared again and again, the individual cultivators and civilians at the foot of the mountain could run away, but the people on the mountain almost did not leave. It was not that no one wanted to run, it was just that they could not leave. There were people who took the risk, but they were all dead now. When it came to dealing with deserters, it seemed that regardless of whether it was the righteous path or the evil sect, everyone's methods were similar. It was nothing more than a way to kill the chicken to warn the monkey. After the corpse was publicized, more people were silent. Not only in Fuyunji, the other major forces were in a similar situation. Because he had completed the task of dealing with the traitor, Old Ma's position in Fuyunji rose again. At least for now, it seemed that Shui Ying already trusted him a lot. In the Great Hall of Fuyunji, Shui Ying would often ask Old Ma to stay behind to discuss matters. It was the same on this day. After making careful arrangements and making sure that all the elite troops of the Floating Clouds Company were ready to fight at any moment, Blood Warbler once again checked the locations of as many as a dozen dangerous checkpoints in the Floating Clouds Company's territory that could be attacked. Only then did she sit down while rubbing her brows in a somewhat tired manner. Old Ma was lost in thought as he looked at a square far away from the main hall. There were two people lying motionlessly on the ground. He knew that the two of them were already dead. Last night, they couldn't withstand the tension on Mount Celestial Dragon and the aura of the apocalypse. They wanted to sneak away but were caught and killed on the spot. Old Ma did not want to know exactly how they had died. However, he understood why the two corpses had been dumped in the core area of the Floating Clouds Company's territory. The death of a spy was to be seen by the enemy, while the death of a deserter was to be seen by his own people. He silently withdrew his gaze, looked at Shui Ying and said, "Hallmaster, continuing this stalemate isn't a solution. What should we do next?" Shui Ying closed her eyes and said, "Let's wait." Old Ma frowned and asked, "What are we waiting for?" Shui Ying said, "Once Lord True Monarch gives the signal, we can start attacking those three trashes." Old Ma's eyes lit up. "What signal?" Shui Ying hesitated for a moment, then opened her eyes and looked at Old Ma. Old Ma was startled, then smiled bitterly and said, "I was presumptuous." Shui Ying shook her head. After pondering for a moment, she said, "Your identity is different now, so it doesn't matter if I tell you." At that time, Lord Supreme only mentioned that there would be a great change in the weather and the appearance of doomsday calamity, and it was very obvious. Once it appeared, we would be able to see it. At that time, it would be our time to take action. Great change in the weather? Appearance of doomsday calamity? Old Ma murmured a few words, then looked up at the blood moon in the sky and the sea of blood outside. He smiled bitterly and said, "So this is not the worst situation?" Shui Ying also seemed to be somewhat helpless. She nodded and said, "It should be." The two of them didn't say anything more. It seemed that their expressions were very heavy. Even people of high status like them shuddered at this moment. None of them knew what fate awaited them. At that moment, they seemed to have sensed something at the same time. They turned their heads and looked towards the sky outside. They saw that the blood moon in the sky suddenly brightened and trembled. Amidst the sea of blood, a strange and enormous beam of moonlight sprinkled down from the sky. Fate was like a torrent, surging and roaring, carrying everyone into the future. The people on the mountain were very different from the people at the foot of the mountain, but there were also many similarities. There were many unfairness in this world, but some things were naturally fair. For example, the sky, the sun, the moon, the stars, wind, rain, thunder and lightning. Almost everyone faced the same thing. Just like now, the people on the mountain saw the beam of light from the blood moon sprinkling down on the immortal city. The people at the foot of the mountain also saw it. The color of the beam of moonlight was much deeper than before. Although it was still dark red, the color was translucent. The light inside was like a real object. From afar, it looked like a top-grade blood agate gem. It made people's hearts tremble. The light sprinkled down. Strong winds howled in the sky. Countless dark clouds were pulled down and wrapped around the beam of moonlight by the strong winds. They gradually turned into some strange and distorted symbols that were embedded on the beam of light. Everywhere the light went, it was blood red. Then, the beam of moonlight directly sank into the ground. However, the beam of light didn't disappear. It still existed between heaven and earth. No one knew what the situation in the underground world was like now. However, in the immortal city above ground, the situation also changed with the appearance of this beam of moonlight. More accurately, with the change of the blood moon in the sky, there was a huge change. In countless dark corners, at the end of the streets and alleys, the black shadows that crawled in the empty houses all looked up at the sky at that moment. The blood moon hung high in the sky, like a high and mighty god. Pada! This was a small sound. In a corner that no one knew, a trembling figure seemed to be unable to support his body. Then he slowly knelt down. He knelt down and worshipped the blood moon in the sky. His eyes turned blood red in the darkness. He muttered some vague yet strange words, describing a kind of worship in the ancient times. He knelt towards the blood moon. It was as if at that moment, he had completely let go of his reason. He lost his clarity of mind. In his eyes, there was only that blood moon. His soul was occupied by a strange aura and burned away. What was left was only an empty shell. Then, a new power took over his body. In the darkness, that person's body twisted. He howled in pain. His hands started to grow longer. His back started to arch. Even the fingers on his palms grew sharp white claws. Silently, he had become a beast in the darkness. Chapter 691. It was a leaf. The green leaf was full of vitality and was about the size of half a palm. It was shining in perfected Lord Tianlan's hand. The leaf was so beautiful and full of vitality that when perfected Lord Tianlan took it out from his bosom, everyone felt a gentle spring breeze brushing past their faces. Even in this gloomy and depressing underground world, it was as if spring had arrived at that moment. It was as if the spring breeze was blowing and hundreds of flowers were blooming, giving off the fragrance of plants and trees. Of course, there was no grass or trees here, nor was there any strange scene of flowers and plants growing crazily. However, at that moment, everyone seemed to see the illusion of spring. Even though it was only a fleeting illusion, everyone's expression changed. It was obvious that this leaf was a rare treasure that could shake the mind of a divine transformation perfected lord. In this small courtyard, Lu Chen's expression changed the most. The shock on his face was also the most intense. However, in the eyes of the other three divine transformation stage perfected cultivators, Lu Chen's cultivation was slightly weaker, so they didn't pay much attention to it. It was not strange that a treasure that could affect a divine transformation perfected lord would affect others even more. Perfected Lord Tiehu and perfected Lord Guangbo didn't even look at Lu Chen. Instead, perfected Lord Tianlan turned to look at Lu Chen, but he didn't say anything else. However, only Lu Chen knew that at that moment, his heart, or to be more precise, the seed hidden in his heart, suddenly throbbed violently. He knew the origin of the leaf. In fact, there was only one kind of leaf in this world that was worth the attention of a divine transformation perfected Lord. It was the treasure of the devil cult, the leaf fragment left behind by the legendary Tree of God. After the leaf of the Tree of God appeared in perfected Lord Tianlan's hand, the expressions of perfected Lord Tiehu and perfected Lord Guangbo changed slightly, but not in the same way. Lord Guangbo was shocked at first, and then he revealed a puzzled look, as if he had not figured out what Lord Tianlan was going to do. His eyes were filled with vigilance. Lord Tai, who was also surprised at first, but then he revealed a look of understanding, and a cold smile appeared on his face. He pointed at true Lord Tianlan and sneered, "Tianlan, you really have the ambition of a wolf. To us and the world, you only said that you are absolutely irreconcilable with the devil cult for decades, but who would have thought that you would secretly take this evil thing of the devil cult as your own? What are you trying to do? Deceiving the heavens, going against the law, and disregarding the righteousness and justice of the world, the Immortal Alliance will definitely not tolerate you." As he finished speaking, his expression had already become stern and solemn. Perfected Lord Tianlan looked calm and indifferent, as if he did not care about Lord Tiehu's righteous words at all. He only looked at him with interest, and then he gently threw the leaf. The green leaf floated 3 feet in front of him, and waves of green light spread out silently, like a bright lamp full of hope in this gloomy and depressing world. When the leaf moved, the whole underground world seemed to light up, and then something suddenly changed. At this moment, the 3 of them were standing in the moonlight of the blood moon. They looked up at the same time and saw a beam of blood moon light, which seemed to be condensed from the essence of the moon. It was deep and bright, like a blood crystal, and was slowly being led down from the sky, falling towards the leaf. In the world of the catacombs, there was a sudden hissing sound, and an invisible wind suddenly blew. Then, outside the circle that was enveloped by the light of the blood moon, countless lightning bolts suddenly appeared and rushed towards the leaf like a tide, but were immediately blocked by the light shield of the blood moon. Even so, the power of the blood moon, under the attack of the lightning bolts, trembled for a moment, and seemed to be on the verge of collapse. However, the blood moon in the sky quickly released a brighter light, and the light shield was supported by a strong force, and quickly stabilized. However, the strange thing was that the beam of deep blood crystal-like moonlight that fell from the sky stopped moving, as if the power of the blood moon had been dispersed, and could no longer take care of the leaf. Tiehu and Guangbo, who were originally surprised and nervous, relaxed. Lord Tiehu even turned his head to a certain direction outside the house, and said with a smile, "Brother Guyu, good move." Somewhere in the empty underground city, a hearty laugh came. Only the voice could be heard, and the figure could not be seen. The long laugh said, "Insignificant tricks, Brother Tianlan, please excuse me." Perfected Lord Tianlan glanced sideways at the direction of the laughter, and his left shoulder seemed to rise slightly in the middle of the laughter. However, almost at the same time, perfected Lord Guangbo suddenly took a step forward, and like a ghost, he suddenly appeared between perfected Lord Tianlan and the source of the voice outside. The chief sovereign of the Grand Chancellor put his hands behind his back, and said to perfected Lord Tianlan with a smile, "Brother Tianlan, don't be angry." Perfected Lord Tianlan's body did not move forward or backward, or perhaps he had forcibly restrained himself. He only took a deep look at the void outside, and there was an incomprehensible look in his eyes. Then he smiled faintly and said, "But it's just a small trick." After saying that, he suddenly raised his right hand again, and put it into his bosom again. This time, the almost identical action caused the smiles on the faces of perfected Lord Tiehu and perfected Lord Guangbo to freeze for a moment. From the beginning until now, especially after the appearance of those divine transformation stage perfected lords, Lu Chen's presence here had suddenly decreased, and he was basically like air. He himself did not have any thoughts or discomfort about this. Perhaps after so many years of being a shadow, He had long gotten used to this sense of existence outside of sight. He was also observing the situation and perfected Lord Tianlan's every move. Unlike the few divine transformation stage perfected lords, when the leaf was thrown out by perfected Lord Tianlan, and it began to trigger the aura of heaven and earth and cause the blood moon to react strangely, Lu Chen's heart was already in a perilous state, although he maintained a calm expression. Even though the phenomenon in front of him was different, the surrounding aura, the changes in the weather, and the faint vibration from the bottom of his feet made him recall the scene of the battle in the barren valley back then. It was too similar, too similar. The person in front of him, the casting of the Tao technique, and even the strange changes in the world were all completely different. However, as the only person who survived the God-subduing mantra formation, Lu Chen could still deeply feel that this aura, if all external appearances were thrown away, there was something, some kind of power, that was completely the same in essence. They were burning and activating the power of the fragment of the Tree of God, which then triggered the changes in the world. Lu Chen suddenly raised his head and looked at the sky. The blood moon was shining brightly. Next to it, the surging dark clouds in the sea of blood had already begun to spin wildly, as if driven by an invisible force, gradually forming a huge whirlpool of a storm. Chapter 692. In the underground cave, the few deity transformation stage perfected lords were stirring up trouble. Although they hadn't started fighting yet, the commotion created was already extremely great. Even the blood moon in the sky was affected, and the magic formation on the ground was also affected. Lights flashed incessantly, and a mysterious aura began to float in this underground world. Coupled with the dull sounds that came from the depths of the underground from time to time, it was like a curse full of resentment. It seemed that a terrible thing was hiding under the earth, and after thousands of years of suppression by darkness, it finally saw a glimmer of life today. Therefore, that inexplicable and mysterious existence seemed to be struggling, roaring, and hitting, desperately trying to find that exit and return to this world. The atmosphere in the underground cave had unknowingly become very tense, especially outside the halo of the blood moon. It was dead silent, and only the seemingly lifeless light of the magic formation was flickering. White Lotus and Atsu, who were hiding in that passage, of course saw clearly what happened outside, from the fall of the blood moon to Supreme Lord Tianlan taking out that leaf and causing the wind and clouds in the sky to change. They did not miss a single thing. After all, such a big movement could not be missed by a blind person. White Lotus quietly retracted her neck, and there was a trace of seriousness on her face. Then she looked at Atsu and said, 3 against 1. Shameless. Atsu glanced at her and growled in a low voice, as if it did not agree. White Lotus was stunned for a moment, and then she sneered at Atsu and said, "Come on, in front of those 4 old men, your Lu Chen is not even a person." Atsu growled and looked a little unhappy. Then, it turned its head and looked outside again. At this time, it saw Supreme Lord Tianlan put his hand into his clothes again, as if he was about to take out the second thing. Everyone's attention was on that damn bald man. Atsu hesitated for a moment, then suddenly took a step forward and walked out of the passage. White Lotus was taken aback. She stood up and stared at the black dog in shock as it slowly but surely made its way towards the city below. In the center of the city, perfected Lord Tunlun, who was still standing on the stone slab in the small pavilion, had already withdrawn his hand from his chest. A dark green light shone down and was somewhat dazzling. Everyone involuntarily looked over and saw that there was another item in the bald True Lord's hand. It looked like a tree branch. It also had an emerald green luster and an abundance of life force. Almost immediately, one could sense that it was of the same origin as the leaf from before. However, for some reason, although it seemed to be full of vitality, there seemed to be some indescribable emptiness in the depths of that layer of green light, as if something was missing. It was a tree branch from the fragment of the Tree of God. Lu Chen stood motionless on the spot, but he clenched his fists slightly. The seed in his heart throbbed again, and at the same time, a wave of warmth seemed to be emanating from his heart. This essence aura should have belonged to this tree branch, but at some point in the past, it was coincidentally absorbed by the seed in Lu Chen's heart. Those who could reach the level of a soul formation perfected Lord would not be short-sighted. Perfected Lord Tai Hu and Perfected Lord Guangbo's expressions darkened at the same time. Even Perfected Lord Guyu, who had been hiding in the periphery and had yet to appear, let out a low and fleeting exclamation. Perfected Lord Tianlon turned a blind eye to their reactions. He only flicked his fingers, and the tree branch of the Tree of God floated into the air and landed right next to the floating leaf. The green light shone brightly, and the tree branch and the leaf began to shine at the same time. The two auras of the same origin and root rapidly and violently fused together. Then, as if half of the leaf was attracted, it flew towards the tree branch and landed on another branch on the tree branch, fusing together seamlessly. It was as if it had always been like this, as if it had never left. No matter how much wind, frost, rain, and snow it had been through, from the ancient times to the present, this leaf once again returned to its original place on that tree branch. It landed peacefully on that tree branch and fused together, becoming a tree branch with a green leaf growing on it. When these two legendary divine objects actually merged together, a strange sound suddenly rang out in the distant sky, in the depths of the vault of heaven that was even higher than the blood moon and the sea of blood that filled the sky. It sounded like an ancient Sanskrit chant, but also like a long chant, as if an ancient god had awakened from a dream, slowly opened his eyes, and was looking back into the distance, searching for that call that had only appeared again after who knew how many years. After the leaf of the Tree of God and the tree root combined, the field was instantly filled with green light, and the strong aura of vitality seemed to be several times stronger than before. At the same time, with this strong momentum, the power that Perfected Lord Tianlon had activated suddenly skyrocketed. The beam of blood crystal moonlight that had been blocked outside and stagnated once again broke through the obstruction and continued to fall where they were standing. This change made the expressions of Perfected Lord Tiehu and Perfected Lord Guangbo change. Perfected Lord Guangbo shouted angrily, looking very angry. He scolded Perfected Lord Tianlon, "Bastard Tianlon, are you really crazy? How many evil objects of the devil cult have you secretly stolen? Such perverse behavior is not tolerated by heaven and earth." Perfected Lord Tianlon and Lu Chen ignored Perfected Lord Guangbo's righteous roar and did not take it to heart at all. Lu Chen just carefully looked at the branch in midair with a subtle expression. After getting the leaf, the branch of the Tree of God that had combined the two treasures seemed to have surpassed the seed in his body in terms of power and aura. At the same time, the feeling of uneasiness in his heart grew stronger and stronger. He raised his head to look at the sky once more. Indeed, above the blood moon, the vortex that was gradually forming had already taken shape. Moreover, at the very center of the vortex, there was a huge and deep black hole. It was so deep that it seemed like there was no end to it, and only darkness existed within it. Everything seemed to be about to repeat itself. The corner of Lu Chen's eyes twitched slightly and he lowered his head. However, he did not have any intention of making a move. Instead, he quickly looked around with a puzzled and worried expression. At this moment, what was reacting with the new branch of the Tree of God must be the God-vanquishing mantra of the devil cult. Even if it was not, the difference was limited. It must be the divine sense that could directly open the passage to the previous world with the power of the fragment of the Tree of God and attract the ancient devil god. However, he had clearly seen the God-vanquishing mantra back then. There was a Dharma formation and how the elders of the devil cult operated it. However, now that Perfected Lord Tianlon was standing in front of him, Lu Chen realized that he had no idea where the Dharma formation of the God-vanquishing mantra was. That thing must exist, but there was no sign of Perfected Lord Tianlon casting a spell on him. So where was this mysterious new God-vanquishing mantra? Lu Chen's eyes flickered like lightning. He suddenly turned his head and looked at the city's spirit formation that was shaking and no one cared about anymore. Chapter 693. The sky above the immortal city became even more gloomy. It was already gloomy, but now a huge black whirlpool had appeared out of nowhere, and the blood moon was hanging in the middle of the whirlpool. In the dark background, the blood moon seemed even more mournful. Perhaps it had been stimulated by this sudden power, but the blood moon's light quickly brightened. Then, waves of dark red light fell from the sky, covering the entire immortal city and every corner. Even Celestial Dragon Mountain, which had been the least affected before, could not escape this time and was completely enveloped by the blood moon's light. The dark red light covered the sky and swallowed everything. Celestial Dragon Mountain, in the Great Hall of Fuyunji, Old Ma withdrew his gaze and turned to look at Xueying. Xueying was also staring at the sky outside the Great Hall. After looking at the mournful blood moon, she looked at the huge whirlpool and the endless darkness that had suddenly appeared in the sky. It was like a bottomless abyss hanging upside down in the sky. It seemed that if one stared at it for a moment longer, they would have the illusion of falling into it. After a moment, Xueying also withdrew her gaze and let out a long breath. Old Ma asked her, "Does this count as a change in the weather?" This clearly should count. Such a violent and huge change in the weather could not be any more obvious. Only a blind person would not be able to see it. Xueying also smiled bitterly, then nodded. Her voice sounded a bit low as she said, "It should be." Old Ma didn't say anything. He just stood up and walked a few steps towards Xueying, stopping in front of her. Xueying glanced at him. The trace of exhaustion on her face seemed to deepen. She stretched out her white fingers and rubbed the space between her eyebrows. After a moment of silence, she said, "Send the order." Old Ma stood where he was without moving. Xueying waited for a moment, then looked up in surprise at Old Ma. She then frowned and said, "What is it?" A hint of hesitation flashed across Old Ma's face, as if he was struggling with something in his mind. After a while, he suddenly lowered his voice, looked at Xueying, and said in a low voice, "Hallmaster, I have something to say." Xueying stared at him and said, "Speak." Old Ma took a deep breath and said, "In this battle, we, Fuyunji, will have to fight against 3 enemies at once. Although we are strong and fearless, we can't say that we have the upper hand. But this time, the civil war in Zhangxianmeng, needless to say, is a battle of life and death. What I don't understand is..." At this point, Old Ma clearly paused and raised his eyes to look at Xueying. Although Xueying's charming face was a little pale, she did not have much of an expression on her face. She only looked at him quietly. Old Ma hesitated for a moment, then finally gathered his courage and said, "Hallmaster, I don't understand." At such an important time, why is the True Lord not here to command the overall situation? Also, even if the True Lord has other plans and can't leave, he still gave us the signal to launch the general attack. This is such an important matter, shouldn't he have clearly explained the situation of the signal? Why did he say something so ambiguous about the great change in the weather, this? Xueying's expression slowly changed, but there was no sign of anger. Her face only looked paler and paler, so cold that it was like ice. Seeing this, Old Ma felt a chill in his heart. For a moment, he could not continue speaking. After a while, Xueying said softly, "And then? Continue." Old Ma took a deep breath, gritted his teeth, and continued, "This sounds like, it seems that the matter on the mountain today actually the True Lord does not seem to care that much." The Great Hall of Fuyunji suddenly became quiet. No one spoke for a long time. Because it was so quiet, at a certain moment, the 2 people in the Great Hall felt as if they could hear a heartbeat. Thump thump, thump thump, thump thump. It was the sound of a strong heartbeat, the sound of blood being squeezed out. With a strange rhythm, Xueying and Old Ma suddenly raised their heads at the same time and looked at each other. Old Ma unconsciously opened his mouth and said, "It wasn't me." Xueying suddenly stood up, her expression fluctuating. She suddenly said anxiously, "No matter what, let's pass the order first." Before she finished speaking, a sharp whistle suddenly came from outside. Immediately after, a gust of eye-catching black smoke shot into the sky. It was the emergency fire arrow in Fuyunji. At the same time, the sound of fighting came from many directions in the distance. Some people shouted angrily, some people screamed. It was like a huge wave, rolling in from all directions. Xueying snorted coldly. Old Ma was also slightly surprised. He frowned and said, "These guys, they actually found such a good time to strike first?" Shuang did not say anything more. She quickly walked to the door of the great hall and took out an item from her bosom. Then, she cast a spell and suddenly ran into the sky. With a sharp whistle, a golden light shot into the sky, then suddenly exploded high up in the sky. The golden light filled the sky like a sky full of stars, embedded in the gloomy sky. It was like a beautiful firework, bringing a rare glimmer of light and beauty to this dark and gloomy world. It made people feel refreshed. However, after the splendor, there was a tsunami of battle cries that sounded from all of the Floating Clouds Company's territories. The valiant elites that had long been prepared rushed out from the corners of the ambush. They faced the enemies of the other three factions that had suddenly launched an attack and began a bloody massacre. The battle cries were already everywhere in the distance, but Fuyunji's great hall was still very quiet. Old Ma stood behind Shuang with a somewhat complicated expression. After a while, he said in a low voice, "Since it has begun, let's also go to the front." Before he finished speaking, he saw Shuang suddenly take a few steps back, hiding in the shadows of the great hall. At the same time, he heard this woman say in a low voice, "Come here, don't let the moonlight shine on you." Old Ma was startled. For a moment, he didn't understand what she meant. He subconsciously looked up and saw that the blood moon in the sky had suddenly become blood red. Then, the moonlight that sprinkled down suddenly became as thick as blood. It was currently sprinkling down from the immortal city at the foot of the mountain towards Mount Tianlong at an incomparably fast speed. The thick blood like moonlight swept everything. Not long after, it arrived near the great hall of Fuyunji. Old Ma suddenly felt a chill in his heart. His body immediately flew backwards. The moment before the moonlight swept across the great hall, he hid beside Shuang. In that shadow, there was a bit of coldness. The towering roof of the great hall blocked the blood like moonlight. The blood-red light swept across the great hall, then flew into the distance. Further away was the place where the battle cries were the loudest. It was unknown how many people were risking their lives to kill. It was also unknown why they were doing this. Old Ma turned his head with some difficulty and looked at Shuang. He saw that this woman's face was completely pale, as if it was transparent. She clenched her teeth and didn't say a word. Chapter 694. Lu Chen was in a trance for a moment. It was as if he had returned to more than 10 years ago, when he had witnessed that shocking change in the desolate valley. Although it had been many years, the strange and huge eye that had appeared in the sky at that time was still clearly in front of his eyes and had never faded from his mind. He knew that compared to the owner or some kind of power that the eye represented, he was as insignificant as an ant. He also knew that on that day, perhaps that I didn't notice him at all, but at the end of that clamorous change, it was he who unexpectedly made a move and ended everything. He had used the black sword to kill Yun Shouyang, thereby disrupting the god-subduing mantra formation, and then caused the elders of the devil cult and the fire shaman of the barbarian tribe, who were receiving that godlike power, to be smashed to pieces by the chaotic and violent power. Before they died, they had miraculously broken through the limits of the human race, forcibly raising their cultivation from the ordinary Yuanying realm to the realm of deity transformation perfected monarch, and perhaps even stronger. Such a powerful and unimaginable power was not something that a human could achieve. Lu Chen had a clear understanding of this, and as the only person who had survived the strange change and the collapse of the god-subduing mantra, he had always kept his mouth shut about this power and had never mentioned it to anyone else. He had not even mentioned it to perfected Lord Tianlong, who had a special relationship with him, or his old friend Old Ma, who had accompanied him for many years. If he had told Old Ma about this, it would have been a disaster for him, but if he had told perfected Lord Tianlong about this terrifying power, Lu Chen knew that the damn Baldy would definitely pursue it. For someone like perfected Lord Tianlong, who had already stood at the peak of the human race and was even more powerful than the elders of the devil cult and the fire shaman, it was impossible for him to resist such a temptation. It was like a person who had walked a very, very long distance and had left behind everyone in the world. There was only darkness and confusion in front of him, and all that was left was loneliness. If a small path or a patch of light suddenly appeared at this time, the result would be self-evident. However, Lu Chen raised his head and looked at the huge vortex in the sky with a bitter smile on his face. After so many years, everything seemed to have returned to its original point. The secret that he had kept should have disappeared from the world, but now it reappeared again, and it happened to be in the hands of Supreme Tianlan. He stealthily took 2 steps back, completely hiding himself behind Supreme Tianlan. Although the attention of the 2 divine transformation stage perfected monarchs was focused on perfected monarch Tianlan, the aura of the 2 divine transformation stage perfected monarchs still exerted a lot of pressure on Lu Chen, who had yet to reach this level. In comparison, perfected Lord Tianlan's burly body was like a wall. When Lu Chen stood behind him, he immediately heaved a sigh of relief. That heavy pressure was immediately blocked by more than half. His gaze swept across Supreme Tianlan's broad back, and once again he felt that this scene was very familiar. In the air, the branch that had fused with the divine tree's leaf shone brightly. Its aura was boundless, and it exuded an aura of boundless vitality. It also attracted a particularly dense beam of light from the blood moon in the sky, causing a change in the weather and the appearance of that huge vortex. All of this was extremely similar to the god's subduing mantra formation in the past. However, after observing for a while, Lu Chen gradually realized that something was wrong, or rather, it was not enough. The vortex in the sky was boundless and terrifying, but up until now, it was still spinning without directly opening a crack in the sky like it did in the past, revealing that mysterious eye. Lu Chen could even clearly sense a strand of terrifying energy faintly flowing in the sky. It was howling and tearing, yet it was unable to break through that invisible boundary. He pressed his hand lightly on his chest and looked expressionlessly at the branch in the air, thinking, it seems that in the end, this branch's leaf is still inferior to that seed. Even he could tell that the few perfected lords of the soul formation realm on the other side were also able to see through some of the subtleties in the situation. The slightly nervous expressions of perfected Lord Tiehu and perfected Lord Guangbo relaxed. That mysterious perfected Lord Guyu still did not show up outside, but it seemed that she did not have the intention of making a move. Perfected Lord Tiehu smiled and said to perfected Lord Tianlan, why do you still use this kind of evil art? Do you really want to do something with those inexplicable things of the devil cult? Perfected Lord Tianlan seemed a little surprised and frowned slightly. He had probably expected that the 2 treasures of the devil cult, the branch and the leaf of the divine tree, would be enough to activate and open the crack in the sky. However, for some reason, the power of these 2 treasures seemed to be greatly reduced, and he actually felt that his efforts were in vain. Just a little bit more, but he still could not achieve his goal. For the first time, his face became serious and solemn. He carefully looked at the branch and leaf in the air for a moment, as if he was thinking about something. Standing behind him, Lu Chen smiled bitterly. In this world, he was probably the only one who knew why the branch of the divine tree would suddenly have an accident at this critical moment. It was because it did not have enough power. Of course, it was because a part of the essence of the branch had been absorbed by the seed in his body. Just when Lu Chen began to nervously think about the current situation, the 2 perfected lords of the divine transformation realm opposite him refused to let go of this great opportunity. After greeting each other, perfected Lord Tiehu and perfected Lord Guangbo slowly walked forward, sandwiching perfected Lord Tianlan from 2 directions. Not to mention that behind perfected Lord Tianlan, there was another master of Starry Hall hidden somewhere in the empty city. We have been planning for a long time just to trap you when you leave the base of Skydragon Mountain and are alone. Perfected Lord Tiehu said calmly, for this reason, we have already made thorough preparations. You have no chance to escape. Perfected Lord Guangbo sneered and said, seeing that we have known each other for many years, I will give up resisting and spare your life. As long as you live underground for 100 years, we will let bygones be bygones. As they spoke, the 2 of them had already walked half of the way and were getting closer to perfected Lord Tianlan and Lu Chen. Perfected Lord Tianlan snapped out of his thoughts and glanced at them. There was no fear or nervousness on his face. Instead, there was some disdain in his eyes as he looked at them indifferently. Just the two of you trash? Useless things. He was probably the only person in the world who dared to call two perfected lords of the divine transformation realm useless things. Perfected Lord Tianlan did not pay attention to the two opponents who suddenly changed their expressions. He reached into his arms again and a green light suddenly scattered. At this moment, the expressions of everyone present, including Lu Chen's, had changed. Their faces were filled with disbelief, and astonishment. The third fragment. He actually had a third fragment of the devil cult. Chapter 695. In fact, the Tree of God had never appeared in the world. Or, at least since the beginning of human history, there had never been any mention of the Tree of God in the divine central continent. All the information about the Tree of God only existed in legends and myths, and only in the legends of the devil cult. In fact, after a long time, even in the devil cult, the legend of the Tree of God had been on the decline for many years. After all, it was just an illusory myth that was of no help to the reality. After years of forceful suppression by Zhengxian Meng, the devil cult struggled to hold on, and most people's impression of the Tree of God was just an ancient legend. As for whether it was true or not many people actually cared. Lu Chen had lurked in the devil cult for many years and knew the mentality of the people in the devil cult very well. The more ordinary a member was, the less they cared about the legend of the Tree of God. On the contrary, the few bigwigs and elders who stood at the top of the devil cult attached great importance to the legend. And it turned out that there was a reason for this. The fragments left behind by the Tree of God did possess incredible power. The battle in the Barren Valley many years ago and the Blood Moon catastrophe led by perfected Lord Tianlan today all seemed to prove this point. The fragments of the Tree of God were the most important treasures and artifacts of the devil cult, but over the years, they had gradually been lost in the outside world by chance. Even though Lu Chen had secretly obtained the seed of the Tree of God, the most important of the fragments, he had never really imagined that he could have all the other fragments. Until today. He saw with his own eyes that perfected Lord Tianlan magically and bizarrely took out the fragments of the divine tree one after another as if he was performing a magic trick. When the third fragment, another leaf that was full of vitality and was glowing with a green light, appeared in his hand in front of everyone's eyes, even Lu Chen, who was always calm, could not help but be dumbfounded. This damn Baldy, this crazy lunatic, this peerless genius. Is there anything he can't do? How many more secrets are hidden in him? When perfected Lord Tianlan took out a second leaf from his pocket, Lu Chen's expression changed drastically, and the expressions of the two perfected lords of the divine transformation stage opposite them also became very interesting. Supreme Guangbo was shocked at first, then he was speechless. Although they were enemies now, Supreme Guangbo couldn't help but say, "Old man Tianlan, when did you rob the lair of the devil cult? You actually have so many fragments, really?" He seemed to be at a loss for words for a moment. After a pause, he shook his head and said with a bitter smile, "You have been fighting with the evil cult for the past few decades. Now it seems that all the foundation of the evil cult has been seized by you." Supreme Guangbo grinned at Supreme Guangbo. His expression was very gentle, but he didn't say anything and looked non-committal. As they were talking, a sudden heavy panting sound came from the side. Both of them and Lu Chen were slightly surprised. They turned their heads together and saw that Supreme Tiehu was standing on the other side. At this moment, his face was green and white, his beard and hair were standing on end, and he was gnashing his teeth in anger. At the same time, his expression was mixed with a bit of shame, pain, horror, and regret. Even his body was slightly trembling, and it seemed that he was extremely angry. Boom! A loud sound suddenly rang out. It was Supreme Tiehu, who seemed to finally be unable to control the fury in his heart. He suddenly hit the nearby wall with his palm. Instantly, the wall cracked, and then a large section of it collapsed with a loud bang, causing dust to fly everywhere. A chilly wind carrying dust blew past the old man, fluttering his clothes and white hair. Supreme Tiehu clenched his teeth and spat out two words from between his teeth, "Bitch?" After being ravaged by Supreme Tiehu's sudden outburst of temper, the already damaged courtyard became even more messy. The few people present seemed to be shocked by this old Tiehu's sudden loss of composure. For a moment, no one spoke, and everyone stared at Supreme Tiehu. The atmosphere suddenly quieted down, and it was somewhat stiff and cold. Supreme Tiehu sensed that something was wrong, but he didn't seem to care. He suddenly raised his head and stared at Supreme Guang Tianlan. His eyes looked like they were about to spit fire, and he fiercely scolded Supreme Guang Tianlan, despicable and shameless. At this point, no one present was stupid. In the blink of an eye, they all understood. Although Supreme Tiehu clenched his teeth and only scolded without saying the reason, it was obvious that he had suffered a great loss from Supreme Guang Tianlan. Needless to say, this seemingly strange private matter was obviously related to the second leaf of the Tree of God that Supreme Guang Tianlan had just taken out. This was because Supreme Tiehu looked calm when he took out the first two pieces of the Tree of God. It was only when he took out the third leaf that he flew into a rage like an old dog whose nest had been broken into. Supreme Guangbo obviously thought of this as well. After the shock on his face faded, he frowned and walked a few steps toward Supreme Tiehu. With a gloomy expression, he asked in a deep voice, "Brother Tiehu, what happened?" Supreme Tiehu wanted to say something but stopped. His expression was ugly, and he finally snorted. He flicked his sleeves and said coldly, "Nothing. It would be weird if nothing happened. Everyone here was as shrewd as ghosts. Who could be fooled by such a crude lie?" Supreme Guangbo looked more and more worried. He shook his head and said, "Tell me clearly, Brother Tiehu. If there is anything that will affect our big event today, you can't hide it." After that, he turned to look at the city outside and said in a clear voice, "Brother Guyu, what do you think?" In the depths of the seemingly empty house, behind a few beams of light, there was a vague silhouette of a person flitting past and disappearing like a ghost. After a while, a voice said, "I think what Brother Guangbo said makes sense." Supreme Guangbo nodded and looked sideways at Supreme Tiehu. Supreme Tiehu's expression became more and more ugly. He even clenched his fists subconsciously. However, he still had some rationality left. After taking a few deep breaths, he gritted his teeth and pointed at Supreme Tianlan with a cold face. "I didn't expect that my adopted daughter, Wenji, was also a shadow that this bastard had arranged." As soon as he said this, there was a sudden silence. Everyone's expression was interesting and strange. Those who could stand here were all well-informed people in Zhengxianming. They had more or less heard some news that ordinary people didn't know. The adopted daughter of the old perfected lord, that charming young woman, had a great reputation in the perfected immortal alliance. As for the real situation after becoming famous, everyone knew it in their hearts. They saw through it but didn't say it out loud to save each other some face. However, if Song Wenji was actually Zhengxianmeng's shadow, the meaning of the matter would be completely different. At this moment, Supreme Tiehu's expression suddenly turned cold. He stopped and cried out, "Oh no, on the mountain." Chapter 696. At this moment, Mount Heavenly Dragon was covered in a blood-red and gloomy scene. Most of it was because the blood moon in the sky had already covered the sky and covered the entire mountain range in a dark red and gloomy color. In addition, the fierce fighting and internal strife that broke out in Zhengxianmeng also added some thick blood to this doomsday-like disaster. The three major forces, Heavenly Law Hall, Deziyuan and Starry Hall, showed their strong foundation and strength. They formed an alliance and attacked the territory of Fuyunji from 3 different directions. There was no doubt that this was the largest and most intense internal strife in the thousands of years since the establishment of Zhengxianmeng. From the beginning of the battle, blood was seen, and then both sides quickly became red-eyed and began to kill. To be honest, although Zhengxianmeng was famous in the world, and in the eyes of most people in the world, it was a famous sect that presided over righteousness and protected the common people. But in fact, this organization was really not a compassionate, kind, and weak place. From the very beginning, the founders of the Alliance of True Immortals were the few most powerful and influential big shots in the world. To put it bluntly, The purpose of establishing this organization was to better occupy and plunder heavenly treasures and earthly cultivation resources. Later, they found that this thing was unexpectedly useful. Not only could they occupy the moral high ground and attack their enemies in the name of righteousness, but they could also rule the world more easily. As for the cultivation resources that were fought over at the beginning, it was simply not a problem. After all, the whole world was under the rule of this huge organization. Those resources could not be snatched as they wanted and used as they wanted. Someone was not convinced? Then beat him until he was convinced. Still not convinced after being beaten? Then directly beat him to death. The dead always had to be convinced. How many years had passed? Under the iron fists of the true immortal alliance, countless heroes had fallen or knelt down. Then, everyone washed their names in the open and in the dark, easily becoming the leader of the righteous path. It really couldn't be any better. Any intelligent person in the world would be able to see that this was a good thing that had both potential and prestige. Who wouldn't be envious? Who wouldn't want to come and have a share of this kind of life? Therefore, for so many years, Zhengxianmeng had never been truly peaceful. There were always twists and turns, and there were always disturbances. The old perfected sovereigns of the divine transformation realm refused to step down from their positions no matter what. The young and ambitious ones tried their best to climb up the ranks. Unless someone like perfected Lord Tianlan, who was exceedingly powerful, jumped out and stood out, it would be very difficult for most of the rest. Very difficult, extremely difficult. However, ambition would not be restrained because of difficulties. Ambition would only go crazy because of the beauty that was close at hand. Then, it would burn one's heart and soul like a burning flame. In this way, in the history of Zhengxianmeng, there had always been internal strife and secret fights. Blood and death had always been with this huge, bright organization. It was said that a long time ago, when Zhengxianmeng was founded, an ancient devil had cast a curse on it, cursing it to sink into the sea of blood forever, never to rise again. Until today, this curse looked like it was going to come true. The Floating Clouds unit was currently the most powerful unit in the true Immortal Union. This was a publicly acknowledged fact for the past 20 years. Even though the other three great powers had attacked them together today, and it seemed like every single one of them had concealed their true strength, all of them possessed even more powerful strength than what they had displayed in the past. However, although Fuyunji was fighting 1 against 3, although they were shocked, they did not panic. Layer after layer of resistance, they fought and retreated. Gradually, they managed to block this terrifying attack. Then, after they stood firm, near their core area, near the main hall of Fuyunji, Fuyunji actually began to show signs of a counterattack. Compared to the other 3 forces that attacked, it seemed that Fuyunji had also hidden their strength. Their true elites had been hiding in the shadows, as if they were preparing for this battle. Therefore, even though it was 1 against 3, the current battle was gradually being equalized by Fuyunji. Fuyunji blocked the attacks of Heavenly Law Hall, Deziyuan, and Starry Hall, and then quickly began to counterattack. In this fierce civil war, the situation was very bloody and cruel from the beginning. Obviously, many people who were in the same Zhengxianmeng usually saw each other frequently and would nod and smile when they met. At this time, they all pulled out their swords, roared with red eyes, and used the most vicious means to kill each other. Blood flowed all over the ground, converging into a river from the top of the mountain, flowing everywhere. They were all the elites of Zhengxianmeng, but now they all seemed to be worthless pawns, constantly killing each other. Sometimes, people even forgot why they were fighting and only had a kind of instinct left, which was to kill with red eyes, because only by risking their lives could they survive in this chaotic and particularly cruel internal strife. The blood moon hung high in the sky, and the blood-red moonlight shone on the top of the mountain, silently watching this human killing. Behind the crazy people who were killing like madmen, in the blood that flowed all over the ground, there was a trace of colorless and odorless aura being extracted from the dark red blood, silently drifting into the sky, and converging towards the blood moon. A bloody aura was exuded in the moonlight, and everyone seemed particularly excited. Then, at a certain moment in the development of the battle, an unexpected change suddenly occurred. In the battlefield that was still fiercely fighting, in the roar of killing that shook the sky, among the three attacking forces, for some reason, the Dazayuan's group felt more and more pressure as they fought. And if one looked at the overall situation from a high place, one could see the changes in this battle. The people of Starry Hall were the slowest from the beginning, and their attack speed was the slowest. Now, after fighting for a while, they gradually retreated, while the people of Heavenly Law Hall were originally determined to fight, but for some reason, as if they suddenly received a strange order in the command, the whole group suddenly became chaotic. After a while, some people in the Hall of Heavenly Law stood dumbstruck on the spot. Some people were still fighting the people of the Fuyun Agency with bloodshot eyes. However, at least half of the troops suddenly turned around and charged towards the troops of the Great Chancellor with strange expressions on their faces. There was no doubt that this was a heavy blow. The Dazayuan's team was suddenly in chaos. Some people shouted angrily, some people scolded angrily, but what greeted them were sharp blades stained with blood. The people of Fuyunji were also stunned, and seemed to be confused for a while. Many people not only did not hit them when they were down, but also subconsciously retreated for a distance, and then turned back to look for their own commander, wanting to figure out what was going on. Then, the people of Fuyunji quickly found another very bad situation. The person who was in charge of the overall situation on Fuyunji's side unknowingly disappeared. Everyone was like a headless fly, fighting and killing in this bloody battlefield. No one knew why. There were only ant-like lives left, but in the bloody battlefield, they collided and killed, as if under the blood moon, this doomsday catastrophe was a sacrifice. Blood was still flowing, and the blood moon in the sky was getting redder and redder. Chapter 697. The construction of Fuyunji's main hall was actually not very long ago. At least compared to the famous halls of Heavenly Law Hall, Dazayuan, Starry Hall, and other old forces of Zhengxianmeng that had been built for hundreds of years, it was still a very young building. From the time it was completely built until now, it had only been a mere few decades. However, although its history was not long and its foundation was not deep, one would not see that everything had a history after entering the main hall, and that every brick and tile had a story. However, from the appearance of the main hall, it could be said that Fuyunji's main hall completely overwhelmed those ancient halls of Mount Tianlong. From the beginning of the construction of this main hall, it had inherited the unruly and insufferably arrogant temperament of the founder of Fuyunji, Lord Tianlong. It was the largest hall on Mount Tianlong and the tallest building in the entire immortal city. It was towering and majestic, and in the past few decades, it had become the most eye-catching place on Mount Tianlong. Lord Tianlong did not seem to understand the principle of, the tallest tree in the forest will be destroyed by the wind. For many years, he had always lived unscrupulously, completely ignoring the gazes of others. Then, the fact was that in these past few decades, he had used his own strength to defeat all doubts and all the traps and undercurrents that harbored ill intentions. Until no one dared to challenge him, he became the person who stood at the peak of the world of cultivation. Even his enemies had to admit that this damn Baldy was powerful to this day. And after so many years of ups and downs, Fuyunji's main hall had also gradually gained respect and awe from the initial glances, scorn, and ridicule. It had gradually become the symbol of power in this huge organization. This main hall was very grand and huge, with all the side halls and side halls. In fact, it was a huge group of halls. Of course, the most eye-catching and largest one was, of course, the main hall of Fuyunji. However, for the people of the Floating Clouds Agency, this hall was very awe-inspiring. However, there was also a very strange thing. This faction was founded by Supreme Lord Tianlong. This hall was also built under his orders. However, he himself hadn't lived in this place for even a day. True monarch Tianlong had built a smaller Kunlun palace for himself to live in, leaving the Floating Clouds Agency's main hall to Blood Warbler and the other high-ranking elites of the Floating Clouds Agency. It was said that when this decision was made, it was beyond everyone's expectations, but it also won the hearts of his subordinates, causing them to become more and more loyal to this bald true monarch. After all, from the beginning, everyone thought that this would be an unprecedentedly magnificent new divine transformation stage perfected monarch mansion hall, because all the other divine transformation stage perfected monarchs did the same. The Heavenly Law Hall, the Great Chancellor Hall, the Starry Hall, and so on, all of them occupied the core halls of their forces as their living quarters. The dome of Fuyunji Main Hall was very tall, blocking out all light. Therefore, although there were many doors and windows in the surroundings, as long as a few of them were closed, the depths of the main hall would appear darker. At this moment, this was the case in the main hall. Far away from the entrance, when standing in the depths of the main hall, darkness flowed over, blocking out the light from outside. Originally, Old Ma felt that this place was always gloomy and did not like the gloomy atmosphere in the depths of this main hall. However, on this day he suddenly discovered that the darkness in this main hall was actually a protective barrier, blocking out the extremely dangerous light of the blood moon outside. The other elites of Fuyunji were not here at this moment. Old Ma knew the movements of some of them, but the rest that he did not know should have been arranged by Blood Warbler to defend against the attacks of the other three forces. Right now, they were in a bloody battle. The entire main hall was empty, leaving only Blood Warbler and Old Ma. Blood Warbler stared blankly at the strange moonlight that swept everything outside, her face pale. She suddenly shook her head, turned around, and quickly walked into the depths of the main hall. Old Ma was shocked, and subconsciously followed 2 steps forward, but then a strange expression appeared on his face. He saw Blood Warbler quickly walk to a high platform with a throne in the depths of the main hall. This was a seat that was even higher than the seat she usually sat in. Needless to say, this was originally prepared for true monarch Tianlan, but that bald true monarch had never come here before. Blood Warbler walked straight over, and then stretched out her hand behind the throne, as if pressing some secret mechanism. A moment later, a low rumbling sound suddenly rang out in the main hall. On the side of the throne, a secret underground passage appeared. The square staircase extended downwards, and it seemed to be about the width of 2 people. No one knew where it led to. Old Ma opened his mouth wide, took another step forward, and then stopped again. For a moment, he was a bit hesitant, not knowing if he should follow. Blood Warbler did not hesitate, and walked down the secret passage after it appeared. But when half of her body was in the passage, she suddenly raised her head and glanced in Old Ma's direction. Old Ma stood where he was, stunned and somewhat at a loss as to what to do. Blood Warbler was silent for a moment, and then she beckoned to Old Ma. Old Ma swallowed, and his breathing became a bit rough. He looked back at the distant main hall, and under the blood-red moonlight he could faintly hear the sounds of fierce fighting in the distance. Some were screaming, some were roaring, some were shouting, and some were going crazy. It was like a boiling blood feast. He gritted his teeth, and suddenly took large strides, running towards Blood Warbler and the secret passage. Blood Warbler watched as Old Ma quickly ran to her, and then nodded slightly. Her face still looked very pale, but standing in the secret passage seemed to have helped her recover a bit. At least, there was a bit more color on her face. She no longer hesitated, and directly turned and walked down. Old Ma followed behind her, and after one last look at the empty main hall, he followed Blood Warbler underground with complicated feelings. His eyes first darkened, and then brightened again. Old Ma followed Blood Warbler down the stone steps that were dozens of floors high, and came to a tunnel that extended to both sides. Blood Warbler walked forward, and when she reached the side of the tunnel, she pressed on an inconspicuous brick on the wall. Immediately, a rumbling sound rang out again. Old Ma looked back and saw that the stone slab on the ground of the secret passage had already closed, isolating him from the outside world. The fighting and blood seemed to have gone far away. In this underground world, it seemed that even the blood moon could not affect this place. Blood Warbler glanced at Old Ma, and then said in a low voice, "It's safe here, follow me." After saying that, she walked to the end of the passage on the left. Old Ma followed her obediently, staring at the woman's back. His eyes were full of doubts and an indescribable complexity. Blood Warbler seemed to sense something and said, "Do you have something to say?" Old Ma was silent for a moment and then said, "Yes." Blood Warbler said, "Speak." Old Ma suddenly took 2 quick steps forward and blocked in front of Blood Warbler. He then stared into her eyes and asked in a low voice, word by word, "Why me?" Chapter 698. The blood moon in the sky had changed. Everyone in the underground cave could feel it. Apart from Lu Chen, everyone else who could stand here was a divine transformation realm perfected cultivator. They were people who stood at the peak of the human cultivation world. Be it in terms of Tao, cultivation, vision, experience, or even perception, they were all top-notch figures. The changes in the sky naturally did not escape their eyes. The blood moon had changed inside, but it was not because of the pieces of the divine tree that perfected Lord Tianlong had released. When the pieces were put together, they had an imposing manner that attracted the essence of the blood moon in the sky, but it did not have much effect on the blood moon itself. The few divine transformation realm perfected lords could feel it. The other reason for the blood moon to change was another kind of power. Actually, at this moment, when the time to reveal the trump card was approaching, many things were no longer secrets. They were all laid out on the table and could be easily seen. Although the world was covered by the blood-red moonlight and gloomy and suppressed, it also covered many traces of subtle changes. But in the eyes of these divine transformation realm perfected lords, ordinary people could not compare. Not long after, a cold snort was heard. It was true Lord Tiehu who wore a solemn expression and a bit of hatred, while true Lord Guangbo was furious. Pointing at the huge hole above his head, he pointed at the distant sky and the creepy blood moon, spat at true Lord Tianlong and said, "Is this what you did? You let the blood moon absorb the essence of human blood?" He said loudly and angrily, "If you do this, how are you different from those demons of the devil cult?" Lu Chen's body trembled slightly. He stole a glance at perfected cultivator Tianlong, only to find that perfected cultivator Tianlong didn't care about perfected cultivator Guangbo's accusation at all, as if he had heard something stupid that wasn't worth refuting. He was so disdainful that he didn't even bother to say anything. He just flicked his fingers slightly, and the last leaf in his hand flew up and landed on that branch. Just like before, this leaf and the other 2 pieces of the divine tree were indeed divine objects of the same origin. After they were gathered together, there was almost no rejection reaction and they directly gathered together. The leaf landed on the branch and fused with it. 2 green leaves, one above and one below, one on the left and one on the right, seemed to have grown on this branch from the very beginning. They trembled slightly in midair and fluttered in the wind. The emerald green leaves emitted an infinite radiance of vitality, making this underground world seem to be filled with greenery. After the tree branch was completed, there seemed to be a sudden clap of thunder in the air. It was as if something had suddenly awakened, opened its eyes from its slumber, and looked over. The blood moon in the sky suddenly pierced through all the obstacles. Even the magic formation on the ground couldn't stop it. It directly descended and landed on the tree branch. The transformation process happened extremely quickly. From the moment perfected Lord Tianlong took out the divine tree fragment to the moment the divine tree branches and leaves took shape, only a short period of time had passed. Furthermore, although perfected Lord Tianlong seemed to be doing it casually, in reality, his aura was as deep as an abyss with hidden killing intent. Both Tai Hu and Guangbo were at the level of divine transformation true monarch, so they could feel the terrifying aura of true monarch Tianlong. As long as he got closer, he would definitely be greeted with a storm of attacks. In that short period of time, the situation had become somewhat delicate. Currently, Tai Hu, Guangbo, and Gu Yu were besieging Tianlong. Without a doubt, they had the upper hand. However, Gu Yu was controlling the underground magic formation from the outside. He blocked the blood moon from the outside and trapped Tianlong from the inside, so he couldn't get close to Tianlong. Tai Hu and Guangbo were the main forces attacking perfected Lord Tianlong. Perfected Lord Tianlong had been famous for many years. He was valiant and arrogant. Even among the divine transformation true monarchs, he was still the best. Naturally, Tai Hu and Guangbo were deeply afraid of him. Otherwise, they wouldn't have secretly made this plan to besiege him and eliminate him. At the same time, as divine transformation true monarchs, they naturally wouldn't be too afraid. Even if perfected Lord Tianlan attacked them, they were absolutely confident that they could hold on for a while, regardless of whether they would be at a disadvantage or not. However, the problem was that their teammates were obviously here. Therefore, of course, they should let the others rush up to block the crazy Tianlan's desperate and terrifying counterattack. Then, they could restrain Tianlan from the side. It would save energy and be safe. Moreover, they would also have the opportunity to defeat Tianlan and keep his good reputation in their hands. Even if both of them were injured, it wouldn't be impossible. In other words, deep down in their hearts, this was actually the best result. They were all experienced people. How could they not think of this? Even if they had long planned to do this together, it was hard to say how much trust they had in this temporary teammate. Would he really be able to completely trust them when they went up to block the crazy Tianlan's attack with all their might? It was hard to say whether Tianlan would stab them in the back. At this time, the two perfected cultivators of Huashan realms standing opposite to Tianlan suddenly realized that no matter how well they talked before, no matter how determined they were to swear and analyze, they still couldn't believe each other at the last moment. Perhaps it was because at the level of divine transformation true monarchs, everyone was lonely. They were so high and mighty that they wouldn't believe in anything other than themselves. Therefore, these divine transformation true monarchs remained motionless even though they had the upper hand. They watched helplessly as true monarch Tianlan threw out the branch of the divine tree. Outside the ruined house, in the depths of the empty ruins, a long sigh suddenly sounded out. It was the mysterious Guyu true monarch. He still didn't show up, but in that long sigh, there seemed to be a trace of bitterness. There might be lunatics and evildoers present, but no one was a fool. Although the situation was extremely delicate, everyone soon saw through it, including Lu Qin. A slightly sarcastic smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. He shook his head slightly, while the two opposite true monarchs showed a bit of embarrassment on their faces. However, as embarrassed as they were, they didn't say a word or make any movements. After all, in the decades before the rise of Fuyunji, as the representatives of the oldest forces in Zhengxianmeng, the Heavenly Law Hall and the Deziyuan, who were now allies, had also fought to the death in the past. That hatred was engraved in their bones, and that fear couldn't be erased. It was the same for divine transformation true monarchs. Everyone knew that the other party actually wanted to kill you, and the key was that they really had the ability to do so. So, who would really be at ease to expose their dangerous weaknesses? They could only stand like this. No matter how powerful a divine transformation true monarch was, at this moment, restrained by the most superficial emotions and couldn't move, even if it made them look like a bit of a joke. True monarch Tianlan glanced at the two contemptuously, then turned back and smiled at Lu Qin. Although he didn't say anything, Lu Qin understood what he meant. This kind of trash can also be as famous as me in the world? So, let's just get rid of him. The bald madman laughed and then stomped his foot, stepping right on the groove in the stone slab beneath his feet. The rumbling sound from the depths of the ground suddenly became louder. Chapter 699. White Lotus had been hiding in the passageway for some time. It was a good position not far from the exit. The light from the outside couldn't shine in, and she could easily see what was happening in the underground cavern city in the distance by hiding in the shadows. It was just a little lonely. That black dog Inatsu, for some reason, suddenly ran out. After running into the streets of the city, the black dog suddenly gave up walking straight along the spacious streets. Instead, it ran left and right into those small alleys, disappearing in the blink of an eye. White Lotus was left alone in the passageway. She was surrounded by a gloomy and depressing environment. She actually didn't feel afraid, but she still felt a little uncomfortable. White Lotus didn't know where this feeling came from, but there was no doubt that she didn't like it. She chose a relatively flat shadowy corner and sat down, pulling her clothes closer. In the center of the city in the distance, a few soul formation perfected lords were facing off. Moreover, it was very obvious that they had used some kind of magical power to cause the blood moon in the sky to change. Although White Lotus couldn't see the outside world from this corner, nor did she see what had happened to the blood moon, she felt her heart suddenly start to beat faster. Thump, 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 thump. The heart in her chest was beating fiercely, squeezing out a stream of dark red blood from her heart and quickly flowing to the rest of her body. White Lotus felt a little cold, but her heart seemed to be ignited by a ball of fire, burning fiercely, making her feel anxious and uneasy. Cold on the outside, warm on the inside. This was a very strange feeling. White Lotus sat down quietly, no longer looking at the situation outside where a few soul formation perfected lords were facing off. Instead, she looked down at her own body and the pair of palms on her knees. She was still a young girl. Her hands were white and soft, her skin was like jade, and her fingers were slender. However, at this moment, her palms were reflected in her eyes. In the center of her palms, there were a few small dark red spots. White Lotus frowned and rubbed her hands a few times. Then she realized that it was useless. These small spots were not ordinary dirt, but something that grew under the skin of the palm, something that grew in the flesh. White Lotus was obviously startled, and her expression became a little gloomy. She sat on the spot and stared at the spots on her palm for a while. Suddenly, she stood up and quietly walked to the edge of the cave, taking the risk of being discovered. After pausing for a moment, she felt that the big shots in the distance did not notice the movement in this small corner. She then took a deep breath, and with some anxiety on her face, she gently stretched out her hand from the stone wall beside the cave. Outside the cave was the huge underground cavern. Because the blood moon had smashed a big hole in the dome, the blood moon's moonlight shone in. However, most of the light was still shining on the city, especially with the few deity transformation stage perfected monarchs at the center. Moonlight would also be refracted from other places, but the light was much weaker. The place where White Lotus was at was the same. There was also moonlight, but the light was not very strong. White Lotus stared at her palm, and then slowly she placed her hand under the light. She opened her palm. The moonlight shone on her palm. It shone on those spots. Then, those dark red spots suddenly seemed to squirm, and actually began to slowly expand. White Lotus retracted her hand with the fastest speed she could muster. Her face was abnormally pale, and her lips were trembling slightly. She looked at her palm again. At this moment, those spots had already doubled in size, and became an ugly, dark red spot. White Lotus slowly retracted her palm, and tightly clenched her teeth. After a while, she looked up at the figures in the light, and her eyes suddenly revealed hatred. She muttered to herself in a low voice, "You all deserve to die." The light of the blood moon fell from the sky, shining on the underground city that had not seen the light of day for a long time. It reflected the figure of a black shadow running through the gaps between the tall houses. Atsu ran all the way here, but the closer it got to the strange circle of light, the more cautious it became. Later, it even began to run and stop, stopping from time to smell, observe for a while, and then continue to move forward. Its direction also seemed very strange. There was clearly a very clear and simple straight path to the courtyard where Lu Chen was, but Atsu had taken a detour from the beginning. It went through the small streets and alleys and made a big turn, but went around to the side, and then carefully approached the house that was shrouded by the light. At the same time, all kinds of lights were still rising and flashing in the city, and the unknown array was still in a state of activation, but at this moment, it seemed to be a little weak, as if it was having some difficulty dealing with the power that was transmitted from the sky. Atsu did not feel much about this. At most it looked at the constantly shaking light beams a few more times, and then continued to approach the circle of light. Every time it passed by a gap with a slightly wider field of vision, it would look in that direction for a while, and when it saw that Lu Chen was still standing in the light, still unharmed, and at least seemed to be fine for the time being, Atsu would seem to heave a sigh of relief, and then it would lower its head and continue to move forward slowly. This world was so difficult, and this moonlight was so dangerous, isolating all life, but only a black dog still persistently moved forward. In the circle of light, Lu Chen seemed to feel something, and suddenly looked back. But in the place where his gaze swept past, outside the broken walls, The streets and alleys of the city were still empty, not a single person could be seen. If there was a shadow, it would probably be that Guyu true monarch. With such a soul formation true monarch guarding outside, probably no one in the world would be able to approach. At the thought of this, Lu Chen sighed in his heart, retracted his gaze, and focused his attention on true monarch Tianlan again. He watched as he stepped down, saw the stone slabs on the ground sparkling, and then felt the ground beneath his feet trembling, shaking, and rumbling, as if a door was slowly opening a gap in the depths of the ground. That door, where did it lead to, and what kind of monster and what kind of world was behind it? For some reason, he suddenly thought of the seed in his heart. In that ancient tree hole, there were also two doors. One led to an incomparably terrifying void world, and the other had not been opened yet. For a moment, Lu Chen suddenly had an urge to open that door. No one knew if they could live past today, and if they did not know what was behind that door before they died, would they feel regret? His gaze fell on true monarch Tianlan's broad back, but his hand slowly moved to his heart and gently pressed on it. Chapter 700. Atsu cautiously approached the house, and cleverly avoided a few of the strange beams of light that came from the ground. Logically speaking, this black dog was unlikely to have any information about the array that was set up here. For it to be able to come so close, it could only be attributed to Atsu's extraordinarily sharp intuition. But under normal circumstances, a dog could hardly be smarter than a person, especially in this huge array, and the person secretly presiding over the array was an unfathomable soul formation perfected lord. Atsu saw that it was only 4 to 5 feet away from the damaged house, but at that moment, in front of Atsu's eyes suddenly darkened. A figure suddenly appeared in front of it, blocking its path and its line of sight. Atsu suddenly looked up and saw a person standing next to a wall. It was Guyu perfected lord. This old man was also looking down at Atsu. His expression was a little subtle, but there was no worry on his face. But when he saw Atsu, there was a little surprise on his face, then he seemed to find it a little funny, and shook his head slightly. "A dog," he muttered to Atsu in a low voice, then repeated, "It's actually a dog." Atsu stared at the person in front of it, and took a step back, but it did not make a move to attack. Although Guyu perfected lord stood in front of it, blocking its path, and at the same time, there was no sharp aura of a weapon on its body. Perhaps, this was the innate sharp intuition of its celestial wolf bloodline? Although Atu was already very powerful, it was still far from being able to match up to a deity transformation stage perfected monarch. Atsu even lowered its head slightly, showing a somewhat submissive attitude. Guyu perfected lord was slightly surprised, and could not help but take another look at this black dog, and smiled, nodding. "I still have some impression. You seem to be the dog that usually follows beside Lu Chen, right?" After a pause, Guyu's eyes flickered. "Are you going to look for Lu Chen?" Atsu made a low sound in his throat, as if acknowledging this point. Guyu Supreme smiled, and for some reason his gaze became gentler. Taking a step forward, he stretched out his hand to touch Atsu's head. Atu's body moved visibly, as if it wanted to move or resist. But in the end, it resisted and stood still in the same place. Looking at the black dog, the admiration in Guyu Lord's eyes deepened. She gently rubbed Atsu's head and smiled. "You beast, you're quite understanding. There's a good show going on over there. It's not appropriate for you to go over now. Just stay here." Guyu Supreme patted Atsu with a smile, and then sat down on the ground beside Atsu. She did not seem to mind that the ground was dirty, and only patted the ground beside her and smiled. "Come sit, let's watch the show together." No one knew if Atu understood the meaning of Guyu Trueborn's words, but after staring at Guyu Trueborn for a while, Atu turned back to look at Lu Chen. Then, slowly he actually knelt down on his seat, looking especially obedient. Guyu Supreme laughed and nodded. "Little wolf is smart, your future is limitless." True monarch Guyu and black dog Atu met and were intercepted at a place a distance away from Lu Chen and the others. At this distance, there was a circle of light formed by the formation, and there were many tall houses blocking their line of sight. In addition to true monarch Guyu's own methods, No one in that house noticed that there was an additional black dog in the underground cavern. The people in the circle of light, the three demigod lords, and the seemingly irrelevant Lu Chen, were all focused on the new branch of the Tree of God that had already merged with the two leaves of the Tree of God in front of true Lord Tianlan. A gentle green radiance filled with the aura of life was emitted from the strange branch that had just been born, and it surged in all directions like the waves of the sea. At the same time, the blood moon in the sky seemed to be attracted by this branch of the divine tree, and it continuously sprinkled its blood-colored radiance on the ground. Behind the blood moon, the strange and huge whirlpool in the sky continued to spin. At the center of the whirlpool, there was a thick darkness that seemed to be unable to dissipate, and the rumbling of thunder sounded from within, as if something was about to break through the limits of this world. Lu Chen also stared at the branch, and his mind was filled with the scene of the Battle of the Barren Valley years ago, when the demons of the devil cult and the fire shaman burned the seed of the Tree of God, and then activated the God subjugation spell formation, and attracted the otherworldly abnormality. Although the scene and the people were completely different, from the burning thing and the strange phenomenon in the sky, Lu Chen already had a premonition of what he was about to see next. They were eyes that had been engraved in the depths of his memory and had not seen the light of day for a long time. With some contempt in his eyes, perfected Lord Tianlan glanced indifferently at the two experienced divine transformation stage perfected lords of Zhengxianmeng, who had been on par with him for decades. Then he suddenly raised his hand, and without any visible movement, the branch of the Tree of God in the air suddenly fell directly into his hand. Almost at the moment when he reached for the branch of the Tree of God, perfected Lord Tiehu and perfected Lord Guangbo suddenly seemed to wake up from their original state of doubt and hesitation. After looking at each other, they suddenly flew over from the left and right, forming a pincer attack. Without even looking at the two of them, perfected Lord Tianlan suddenly reached out and grabbed the branch of the divine tree. The two dark green leaves on the branch trembled, looking a little dangerous, as if they could fall off the branch at any time. However, perfected Lord Tianlan clearly did not care about this at all. After grabbing the branch of the Tree of God, he directly chopped down at perfected Lord Tiehu with the branch without hesitation. This scene actually looked a little funny, because whether it was the branch of the Tree of God or the leaves, these treasures and divine weapons of the devil cult actually looked very petite and had a somewhat weak appearance. Who would believe that a branch could kill someone? However, at the moment when the branch of the Tree of God swept across, the sound of the wind seemed to suddenly disappear. A dark green light swept across, and then a black crack suddenly appeared in midair. It was a sudden darkness, as if a hole that led to a strange world had suddenly opened, and the darkness inside was about to gush out. This dark crack blocked perfected Lord Tiehu's path. Perfected Lord Tiehu suddenly let out a long roar and his body flipped back, but he seemed to be very afraid of this crack. At the same time, perfected Lord Tianlan flipped his other hand and hit perfected Lord Guangbo, who was rushing over from the other side. Their bodies shook violently, and then they immediately separated. Rumble, rumble, rumble. A loud sound suddenly came from under perfected Lord Tianlan's feet, as if there was a violent life that had waited for too long and finally could not wait any longer, and roared toward the sky. Then, the ground under their feet began to tremble violently, and the ground cracked continuously in all directions. Chapter 701. The sound of footsteps echoed in the tunnel. The dark tunnel in front of them continued to extend forward. At the same time, they could feel that they were slowly sinking, as if they were going deep underground. The tunnel was very quiet. All the chaos and noise of the outside world was isolated outside. It was hard to believe that at this moment, outside of this tunnel, Mount Celestial Dragon, including the entire immortal city, was immersed in a gloomy and mournful light of the blood moon. It was like the end of the world. Just like that, Shui Ying and Old Ma suddenly walked towards an unknown underground place, as if they had nothing to do with it. Why me? Old Ma's question rang out again. Shui Ying still did not stop, nor did she answer. It was as if she did not hear him at all. Old Ma followed this woman for a while. Seeing that she was still acting as if nothing had happened, he could not bear it anymore. He quickly ran in front of Shui Ying and reached out to stop her. He stared at Shui Ying and said, "Hallmaster, can you explain to me clearly? Otherwise, I won't be able to leave with you." His action could be said to be quite rude and bold. For so many years, Shui Ying had ruled over Fuyunji. She was a revered woman in Zhangxianming. Other than those old demigod true monarchs, almost no one dared to speak to her with such an attitude. Shui Ying herself seemed to be a little surprised by old Ma's attitude. However, she was more surprised than angry. Perhaps she knew what was going on. She just stared at the old horse with a strange look in her eyes. Old Ma felt a little guilty under her gaze. He subconsciously withdrew his hand that was blocking in front of her and laughed dryly. He still wanted to explain to Shui Ying, but Shui Ying had already said, "Do you want to live or die?" "Of course I want to live," Old Ma answered without hesitation. However, this answer clearly did not satisfy him. He looked at Shui Ying and said in a low voice, "Hallmaster, I don't know what you want to do now, but I do know that what you're doing now is not funny. You abandoned your brothers who are fighting outside and hid here. Even if we are lucky enough to survive, if Lord True Monarch investigates, how are we going to explain all this to him, perfected immortal?" Shui Ying suddenly interrupted Old Ma's words. She looked at Old Ma with a complicated gaze and a strange expression. There was a hint of pain in her eyes as she said softly, "How much longer do you want to deceive yourself? When has Lord Perfected Monarch ever cared about us?" Her originally pale face suddenly flushed red, as if she was excited. Instead, it added a bit of worldly beauty to her originally cold temperament. She pointed at the passage behind her and said to Old Ma, since the beginning of this battle, how long has it been since you last saw our Lord Jinjuan? Do you know what he's doing right now?" At such a critical juncture, when people were bleeding and risking their lives for him, why was he not here? Where is he? This series of questions suddenly smashed into Old Ma's face, making Old Ma a little confused for a moment. After a while, Old Ma came to his senses. His expression changed in shock, and he looked at Shui Ying as if he was looking at someone he didn't know. "Are you crazy?" Old Ma murmured. "Crazy what?" Shui Ying took a deep breath and said, "I've just had enough. I don't want to be that kind of cloth that will be thrown away after using it. I want to walk a different path that I've thought of." The muscles on Old Ma's face fiercely twisted, as if he had heard the most inconceivable words. He looked at Shui Ying and after a long while, said in shock, You want to rebel?" Shui Ying sneered, then shook her head and said, "No, I'm not rebelling against him. I've followed True Monarch Tianlong for dozens of years. No one in the world knows this person's temperament and methods better than me. If I want to rebel against him, I definitely won't be able to defeat him. But even if I want to find a backer, who can I find?" Old Ma thought for a moment, then asked tentatively, "The other few demigod true monarchs on the mountain right now? Just a bunch of old trash." Shui Ying snorted disdainfully. It seemed that after throwing away her disguise, she actually looked down on the other demigod true monarchs in the Immortal Alliance. If those people want to fight with True Monarch Tianlong, even if they join forces, I don't think they can win. Old Ma was speechless. The moment she opened her mouth, she directly looked down on the other demigod true monarchs. There was really no one in the world who could be her backer. Shui Ying said again, "The situation has developed to this point. I can basically be sure that our Lord True Monarch doesn't plan to care about our lives anymore." Old Ma was shocked and said, "How can this be? This is Fuyunji, it's his life's work." "Bullshit." Shui Ying seemed to suddenly become irritable, or perhaps she was provoked by something. She completely threw away her reserved and polite appearance and cursed in an unusually rude manner. Old Ma was frightened by her. Today, Shui Ying's behavior was completely different from usual. It was as if she had suddenly become a different person, which gave Old Ma a strange feeling. He was thinking nervously in his heart, and at the same time he sized up this charming woman in front of him again. When his gaze swept across Shui Ying's face, that woman's face, which originally did not have any abnormalities, suddenly caused his gaze to freeze for a moment. He stared at Shui Ying and found that in Shui Ying's eyes, There were two blood-red shadow marks that were slowly appearing and continuously expanding. It seemed that half of her eyes had already turned blood-red, and the other half looked like it was about to be devoured very soon. However, Shuang did not seem to feel much about this. She only said bitterly, "We treat him as a god, but he treats us as grass. When we can be used, he uses us, and when we can't, he throws us away. I have risked my life for him and worked like an ox or horse for dozens of years, but today he actually doesn't even want to see me. What have I been doing all these years for?" At the end of her words, her voice had already gradually become mournful and bitter. Her words reverberated in this tunnel, echoing like the cries of ghosts. Old Ma took a deep breath. His palms trembled slightly, but he quickly clenched his fists and firmly restrained himself. He looked at Shui Ying, and his expression became gentle, in stark contrast to Shui Ying's increasingly agitated expression. He even took a step forward and revealed a small smile, saying, "What you said is very true, it is indeed so." Shui Ying panted, and her expression eased slightly as she looked at Old Ma. Old Ma took another step forward and said softly, "But I still want to ask one more question." Shui Ying grunted and said, "Go ahead and ask." Before she could finish the word ask, her voice suddenly became hoarse. Her face suddenly paled, and she lowered her head to look. She did not know when a sharp blade had appeared in one of Old Ma's hands, and he directly stabbed it into her lower abdomen. Chapter 702. Shui Ying grabbed the blade in her abdomen. Her body trembled slightly as anger and disbelief flashed through her eyes. She stared at Old Ma and said in a hoarse voice, Are you crazy?" Old Ma shook his head and said with a frown, "I'm not crazy. You're the one who's crazy. I just don't want to die in your hands in vain." Shui Ying laughed bitterly. For some reason, the blood-red color in her eyes became even more intense, as if they were congested. She gritted her teeth and said while gasping for breath, "I clearly saved you and didn't let you die outside. How dare you repay my kindness with enmity?" "Forget it." Old Ma felt a wave of irritation in his heart for no reason. It was as if there was a tidal wave pounding against his heart, causing him to breathe rapidly. He could not help but feel flustered and depressed. He swallowed his saliva and sneered, "I asked you for a long time why you didn't choose anyone else and only chose me to follow you here. But you didn't say a word. And don't think that I can't see that in this blood moon catastrophe, there are already people who have been invaded by the invisible evil energy and are becoming more and more crazy." His eyes flashed as he looked in the direction of where he came from. In that place, there seemed to be a sudden gust of wind blowing past, blowing through the passage, blowing through the secret door, and blowing through the grand but dark Fuyunji Hall. Outside the door, deafening sounds of fighting suddenly surged like a tide. A sea of blood covered the sky and covered the earth. The blood moon hung high in the sky, and the blood on the ground flowed like a river. Countless Sengxianmeng's elite troops gathered in the vast territory outside the Fuyunji Hall, madly killing each other. Perhaps they were old friends, or perhaps they were allies. But on this day, all these feelings turned into dust and dissipated among the flesh and blood. Everyone howled and screamed. Their eyes were bloodshot as they ran in the light of the blood moon, desperately killing each other. Even most of them had forgotten their so-called standpoint and faction. They were only relying on their instincts to continue this naked slaughter. He was like a berserk beast that had lost all reason. In the air, within the rivers of blood, strands of strange aura were constantly extracted from the pools of blood and gathered towards the blood moon in the sky. At the same time, it made the world seem even more bloody and cruel. The illusion flashed by and Old Ma's body trembled. His gaze once again landed on Shui Ying's face. For some reason, his face looked somewhat ferocious. He gritted his teeth and stared at the woman, growling, "Do you dare to say that if we continue, you won't kill me to silence me and then run away by yourself?" Shui Ying looked at Old Ma, the muscles on her face twitching slightly. She did not know if it was because of the pain in her abdomen or some other reason. She twisted her body, as if she wanted to take a step back. However, Old Ma's hand, which had not loosened its grip on the hilt, suddenly tightened again. The sharp blade in Shui Ying's abdomen suddenly twisted. Then, there were a few muffled sounds, as if it had suddenly activated some extremely evil mechanism. Shui Ying's body suddenly shook and all the blood drained from her face. Her body immediately went limp and fell down. When the blade was pulled out of her body, it could be seen that the shape of the thing had changed. All kinds of sharp teeth crisscrossed each other, and what was even more frightening was that it was still spinning, bringing with it a fountain of fresh blood. Shui Ying's wound was so horrifying that one could not look directly at it. One could also faintly see that the inside of the woman's abdomen had been completely destroyed. It was out of shape and it was hair-raising. The heavily injured Shui Ying covered her abdomen with both hands. Blood dyed her hands red in the blink of an eye. However, she was still alive. Her face was pale as she looked up at the strange object in Old Ma's hand. Then, she sighed and said in a low voice, "Heart-shattering blade? This kind of evil object that even the evil cult's own people are not too willing to take. You actually stole it." Old Ma seemed to be very nervous. There was sweat on his forehead. He kept swallowing his saliva and gasping for breath. At the same time, he looked very angry. He roared at Shui Ying and said, "Bah, you think it's evil just because you say it is? In the past, you were high up and had countless resources. You didn't have to personally fight the evil cult's demons. Of course, you didn't care about these messy things. But what do I have? If I didn't get something to protect myself, I would have died long ago." A strange smile suddenly appeared on Shui Ying's pale face. She looked at Old Ma and said, "This thing is a great evil object. Every owner who took it died very miserably. Looks like I don't have to worry about no one taking revenge for me." "Bullshit." Old Ma scolded angrily. "Nonsense. Lu Chen told me long ago that the things in the evil cult are not good or evil. It only depends on who uses them." He gripped the strange blade tightly and said loudly, "I just want to live." Shui Ying shook her head. She seemed to have exhausted all her strength. She didn't want to say anything more to Old Ma. She slowly leaned against the ground. Her chest was still slightly moving up and down, but her eyes were already slowly closing. Old Ma stared at Shui Ying for a while. Seeing that she was completely motionless, his eyes showed some panic. He panted and pressed his hand against his chest. He could only feel his heart beating violently, as if it was about to jump out. He felt a little dizzy. He shook his head hard. Then he decided to leave this place. Leave this strange tunnel with a strange origin. He returned to the Fuyunji Great Hall. He turned around and ran forward in big strides. He didn't realize that although his speed wasn't slow, his footsteps were already a little unsteady. Even his body was a little crooked. The tunnel in front of him seemed to have no end. It continued to extend forward. Old Ma ran for a long time. However, he still couldn't see the entrance to the secret tunnel that he came from. There was a strange voice buzzing in his head. It made him very upset. In addition to his fast heartbeat, he also felt that his head was about to explode. He suddenly felt very thirsty. He wanted to drink water. Old Ma slowly stopped. He felt very tired. He weakly leaned against the stone wall and gasped for breath. There was a trace of despair in his heart. His mind was in a mess. However, he still retained his rationality. He still remembered the way he came. It wasn't difficult to walk. It was just a tunnel. However, he didn't know why the road in front of him continued to extend downwards. He still couldn't find the entrance. Wait. Old Ma's body suddenly shook. Then, a look of disbelief appeared on his face. The road was descending. He turned his head in shock. A surreal feeling emerged in his heart. He stared blankly for a while. Then, he turned around and began to walk back. His eyes began to become a little scattered. The scenery in front of him began to shake. He didn't know why, but there seemed to be something in the originally empty tunnel. However, it was blurry and couldn't be seen clearly. It was as if he was looking at a flower in a mirror. Old Ma gasped for breath. He kept walking forward. His mind was in a mess. At the same time, his mouth became more and more thirsty. He wanted to drink something. Then he suddenly stopped. He saw Shui Ying lying on the ground in front of him. There was also a pool of blood on the ground. He stared at the pool of blood. Then, his whole body suddenly trembled. His Adam's apple was trembling rapidly. His face was filled with fear and indescribable disgust. Olma took 2 steps back. His legs went soft. He leaned against the stone wall and sat on the ground. His vision started to darken. However, a blood-red color seemed to be swarming towards him from all directions. In the midst of the chaos, an inexplicable image suddenly appeared in old Ma's mind. It was many years ago. In the small mountain village called Qingshitang Village, he opened a small pub. He and Lu Chen would laugh, curse, chat, and drink together. He really wanted to drink another mouthful of that wine. This was the last thought that appeared in old Ma's mind before he closed his eyes. Chapter 703. In one's life, it was almost impossible for anyone to live completely clear. There would always be many puzzling and incomprehensible things that would leave you at a loss and at a loss. Even if it was a person with an incomparably strong will and a person with a clear goal in his heart, it was often the same. Who could see through a person's heart? A strong person might hide a sensitive and fragile heart under the hard outer shell, but everyone would carefully hide their own weakness. This was human instinct. We always preferred to face the world with a sharp edge and hide the softness deep in our hearts. This principle was not complicated, not profound, but many people in the world did not understand, or it could be said that some people had the wisdom to understand this principle, but often they could not see themselves clearly. No matter how high your cultivation was, how strong your will was, it was impossible to really be willing to cut yourself open like a knife. Everything is the world's fault. I am the innocent one. I was forced. I am the victim. Such an excuse is so easy. Lu Chen often thought like this. In fact, in retrospect, this kind of thinking was also a kind of spiritual defense, allowing him to have a little respite in the dark years. Otherwise, during those 10 years of lurking in the evil sect, even if his body could still hold on, his spirit would have long collapsed. Self-analysis was really a very difficult and very painful thing. If it was really so, Lu Chen had once quietly reflected like this, but looking back, he quickly found that the first thing he had to face was the blood that stained his hands during those 10 years. For the so-called righteousness and ultimate goal, and also to win the trust of those evil sect demons, the lives that he personally killed were not only evil sect demons. These things he never talked about. Probably old Ma and Tian Lan Jinjuan knew a little about it, but both of them seemed to have coincidentally forgotten about these things. No one mentioned it, as if everyone had really forgotten about it. Lu Chen also thought that he had really forgotten about it. Until today, when the doomsday catastrophe was gradually taking shape, at the moment when life and death were uncertain, he was like an idle person watching from the side. He suddenly remembered those things in the past. It turned out that he had never forgotten about those vengeful spirits and blood. The shadow was also a human. His mind flashed with those blurry and clear faces, but in the end, it stopped at the last moment before he entered the darkness. There seemed to be a face that he could never forget. It kept churning in his mind, but it was always a distance away from him and he could not get close to it. He raised his head and looked at the sky. The blood moon was faint, and a ray of moonlight shone down, causing his eyes to suddenly turn red. Then, a ball of black flames burned. Lu Chen's body suddenly trembled. At that moment, the mist suddenly dissipated. The black flames and the blood moon intertwined, causing that face, after so many years, to finally appear clearly in front of him. Lu Chen saw her, that woman, the woman who had promised to spend the rest of his life with him. The darkness rose and fell like waves, slowly surging over. He seemed to have returned to that night outside the desolate valley. He saw that familiar black-robed version of himself, holding a black sword as he stumbled forward. Then, Yun Xiaoqing's figure appeared in front of him. She stopped him. She seemed to be saying something to him. Lu Chen's pupils suddenly dilated, and his body trembled slightly. He saw that black-robed man suddenly hug that woman, and then he stabbed the black sword into her chest. The strange phenomenon in the sky was already becoming more and more intense, and the ground under his feet kept rumbling, as if some terrifying monster was about to break free. The sky changed color, and the scene was chaotic. Even people like soul formation perfected monarchs were paying full attention to this side of the world. No one cared that in that little pavilion, there was an insignificant person standing there, even though his eyes were already burning with black flames. Lu Chen felt as if his heart had been stabbed by a knife, and there was a deep chill. But very quickly, after the anger at those people and things that were hidden from him, Lu Chen suddenly realized another fact. That was, other than anger and regret, he actually did not have any other emotions. He originally thought that he would go crazy and fly into a rage, but he did not. He realized that he was like a person who had become numb to his bones and had lost all emotions. Those dust-covered past events only stimulated him for a while, but they could no longer make him as excited as when he was young. Had the years turned him into a walking corpse? People should not live like this. The world was gray, and his heart was numb and desolate. Until one moment he suddenly remembered that in this world there was still a woman. Although she was distant from him, she was like a ray of light that had once illuminated him. How long had it been since he last thought of exit? Perhaps that young girl also did not like this bloody and crazy world. She preferred a sunny and beautiful life. She would definitely hate this world created by a madman. Then, would you be willing to live in such a world? Boom! The earth finally could not withstand the strong underground pressure, and dozens of large and small holes instantly collapsed within a few thousand feet. The shrill ghost howls were instantly deafening. They flew into the air at the same time, and then looked down. They saw that in the depths of the ground, an extraordinarily huge magic formation was slowly appearing. In the center of the magic formation, there was flowing light, as if a small sun had gathered and condensed into a ball of light, emitting a brilliant radiance. But under the ball of light, a spiral-shaped door of darkness was slowly opening. The ball of light emitted strong rays and shone on the door of darkness, as if it was fighting against the power of the darkness. But everything seemed to be too late, and the ball of light was getting more and more strenuous, and it seemed that it would not be able to hold on for much longer. Immortal Tiehu and Immortal Guang Bo, who were in the air, suddenly seemed to understand something. They looked at Immortal Tianlan and roared, "Are you crazy?" Immortal Tianlan's expression was calm, and even his eyes were very gentle. He did not seem to be crazy at all. Perhaps, in his eyes, the one who was crazy was not himself, but the world. He waved his sleeves suavely, and it seemed that he did not even want to talk to these people anymore. Instead, he took a deep breath, and his body suddenly shone with a golden light. A ball of flame suddenly surged out from his hand, and the tree branch of the tree of God was burned. Green light shot up into the sky in the flames. In the farthest depths of the whirlpool in the sky, there was a sudden clap of thunder, as if some god had finally found the direction and opened his eyes. In the deepest darkness, a bolt of lightning tore through the sky, and then an eye slowly opened. Chapter 704. Of course, Lu Chen also saw the terrifying eye that appeared in the huge dark vortex in the sky. At that moment, he had completely cast aside all his doubts and finally confirmed that all this was just a ridiculous reincarnation. The huge eye that spanned across the sky, the cold and emotionless eyes that overlooked all living beings, and the invincible aura that seemed to be able to destroy everything, were exactly the same as the scene that appeared in the barren valley years ago. He still clearly remembered the feeling when he stood in the magic formation of the god-subduing spell and looked up at the sky, and the feeling of staring at that terrifying eye. So many years had passed, but that creepy feeling had never subsided. He could only bury it deep in his heart and not think about it. Until today, it resurfaced again. It couldn't be wrong, it couldn't be wrong. This was the extraterrestrial evil god that the devil cult and the fire shaman of the barbarian tribe jointly summoned in the battle of the barren valley years ago. Many questions that puzzled him were answered at this moment. The various arrangements in this underground cave always gave him an inexplicable sense of familiarity. The aura when the magic formation was activated also reminded him of the secret method of the devil cult's god-subduing spell. It turned out that these were all the same thing. However, why was this happening? Lu Chen looked at the three deity transformation realm perfected cultivators and saw that among them, Tai Hu perfected cultivator and Guangbo perfected cultivator were both shocked and angry. Obviously, they didn't expect that such an unexpected scene would happen in this underground cave, a trap that they had meticulously set up so that they could besiege perfected cultivator Tianlan and finally control the power of Zhang Xianming. Lu Chen even faintly saw a trace of fear in the eyes of the two deity transformation realm perfected cultivators, which was something that would never appear in normal times. As the most powerful figures in the vast land of the divine land, Tai Hu and Guangbo should not have such emotions. They should not be afraid of any power in the world. But today, facing the sky above and the mysterious hell below, the two terrifying forces that did not belong to this world simultaneously appeared here. As deity transformation realm perfected cultivators, their instinctive and keen senses allowed them to feel the terrifying aura of these two forces had the ability to destroy them. Those who had cultivated to the level of soul formation perfected monarch were probably the most afraid of death in the world. Usually, nothing could threaten them. The perfected monarchs of the divine transformation realm were used to the feeling of being high and mighty. They thought of themselves as gods, but now, their faces were pale and their eyes were filled with fear. The only one who was different from them was, of course, perfected Lord Tianlan. Lu Chen was the closest to perfected Lord Tianlan and could see him the clearest. Therefore, he could tell with a single glance that perfected Lord Tianlan's condition was clearly different from the others. His expression had remained calm from the very beginning. Even though the sky was falling and the earth was shattering, the giant eye above him and the demonic ghost below him, these two powers that surpassed this world had appeared, his expression did not change at all. There was a strange feeling in Lu Chen's heart. He stared closely at perfected Lord Tianlan and suddenly remembered the reactions of the third elder of the devil cult and the fire shaman of the barbarian tribe during the Battle of the Desolate Valley. When they operated the god subjugation spell formation and the terrifying giant eye in the sky appeared, the third elder of the devil cult and the fire shaman of the barbarian tribe fell into a state of extreme excitement and madness at almost the same time. It was as if they had longed for this power for many years to the point of insanity. In fact, this was the case. The power that descended from the sky directly poured into the four of them through the spell formation and forcibly increased their cultivation in an unimaginable way. They broke through an unimaginable boundary and reached the deity transformation realm, and there was still no sign of it stopping. It was a realm that the human race had never reached. However, everything came to an abrupt end. At that crucial moment, which might affect the future of the entire human race, Lu Chen suddenly made a move. With the ruthlessness and cruelty of a shadow, he personally destroyed the god subjugation spell formation, turning the four incomparably powerful but also incomparably fragile people into smoke and dust at the same time. However, today, perfected Lord Tianlan didn't seem excited at all. He didn't seem to be envious of the possible increase in power. He just looked up at the sky with an indifferent expression, as if waiting for something. When the sea of blood covered the sky, the blood moon was an exceptionally eye-catching existence when it rose into the sky. However, when the underground formation was activated and a huge dark vortex appeared in the sky, the blood moon looked like an ornament in the vortex. However, the endless blood essence that was absorbed from all directions had gradually gathered on the blood moon in the sky. Gradually, the blood moon also seemed to expand. Its color turned from dark red to deep red, and gradually became so thick that it looked like it was about to drip blood. Suddenly, there was a thunderclap in the sky. The light of the blood moon shone on the branches of the divine tree and suddenly dispersed. It was like a signal, but also like a critical point had been reached, and a rope that had long been stretched taut was instantly torn. The world suddenly darkened for a moment. A faint wind blew from the horizon. The giant eyes were deep, staring coldly at the human world. Darkness swept up from the ground and broke through all the shackles. The originally bright ball of light was instantly dispersed, turning into countless scattered light spots. The light spots fell on the vast land, then extinguished and disappeared. The door of darkness opened, and ghostly wails and wolf howls rang out. The deepest and densest darkness flew out from the depths of the ground, mixed with the eyes of countless ghostly shadows, laughing and howling. At a glance, there were probably tens of thousands of demonic ghosts. It was like a crazy banquet. In this underground cave, there were 4 people standing in midair. Their bodies of flesh and blood immediately attracted a large group of demonic ghosts of all shapes and sizes in the darkness. They seemed to have reached an extreme level of thirst for flesh and blood, and all of them were howling madly as if they had gone mad. However, these people were perfected lords of the divine transformation realm after all, and it was not that easy to get close to them. Perfected Lord Steelpot and Perfected Lord Guangbo both had a slight change of expression on their faces. Then, their bodies trembled, and different Dharma treasures flew out of their bodies. One turned into a halo, and the other turned into a round shield. They protected themselves in the middle, and the demonic ghosts actually could not get close to them for a while. Seeing this, Lu Chen was subconsciously thinking about how to deal with it. He even wondered if he should hide in the seed of the divine tree again. However, he quickly eliminated this idea. Although the seed of the divine tree was mysterious, the 3 people present were perfected lords of the divine transformation realm. Lu Chen had no confidence that he could hide it from them. If he acted rashly, he might expose the secret of the seed of the divine tree. Just as he was feeling anxious, Lu Chen suddenly realized that the dark demonic ghosts that filled the sky were howling and howling, but for some reason, none of them approached him. No, to be exact, Perfected Lord Tianlan had unknowingly retreated a distance and came to Lu Chen's side. Then, the demonic ghosts that seemed to want to devour all flesh and blood in the world actually ignored the 2 of them. They just flew around Perfected Lord Steelpot and Perfected Lord Guangbo crazily and attacked them with all their might. Lu Chen was stunned, and then he turned to look at Perfected Lord Tianlan. Perfected Lord Tianlan seemed to have sensed his gaze and also turned to look at him. His expression was still calm, and he even smiled at Lu Chen. "You're tuning in to the Passion Pages YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure."